Łopatny. Adrian Vale slid the divorce papers across the marble kitchen counter without looking up from his phone. 10 years. 10 years of Amelia working double shifts at a drafting firm to put him through architecture school. 10 years of skipped vacations and borrowed money, and believing in a man who kept promising the good life was just around the next corner. And he ended it like he was canceling a subscription. "You don't fit anymore," he said, still not looking at her. "Camille's world is different. Her people are different." He finally glanced up, and what Amelia saw in his eyes wasn't guilt. It wasn't even discomfort. It was mild impatience, the way a man looks when he's running late, and the traffic light won't change. "You built me into someone you can't keep up with. That's just how it is." If you've ever been left by someone you carried, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button and stay until the very end. Because what happens to Amelia Cross isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about what a woman becomes when the world finally stops telling her who she's supposed to be. The kitchen smelled like the coffee she'd made for him that morning. Dark roast, no sugar, exactly the way he liked it. And it was still sitting in the pot, untouched, because Adrian Vale had been too busy on his phone to pour himself a cup before he decided to end their marriage. That was the detail Amelia Cross kept returning to later, after she'd driven 3 hours north with her hands shaking and the radio off. Not the words he'd used, not the name Camille, which he'd said with such casual ease, it was obvious he'd been practicing it in his head for weeks, maybe months. Not even the way he'd looked at her. That flat, slightly irritated expression that told her he'd already moved past the hard part and was now simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up with his feelings. It was the coffee. She'd ground the beans herself, brewed it fresh, set the mug on his side of the counter without thinking, the way she'd done for 1,000 mornings, the way you do things when a person has become so woven into your daily mechanics that you stop noticing you're doing it, and he hadn't even touched it. That's what 10 years looked like when it was over. A full mug of dark roast going cold on a marble counter. They'd met at the Florida Institute of Architecture during a rainy November open house that Amelia had only attended because her roommate bailed on their dinner plans and she had nothing else to do. She was 24, finishing her second year of a graphic design MFA, and Adrian Vale was 27 and furious. Not at her specifically, but at the general state of things, which seemed to be his default mode. He was standing in this corner of the exhibition hall, arms crossed, glaring at a scale model of a waterfront development project like it had personally insulted him. "It's wrong," he said when he noticed her looking at him. Looking at it? What is? The sight lines. Whoever designed this doesn't understand how people actually move through spaces. They designed it for a photograph, not for a human being. She'd looked at the model, all clean angles and miniature palm trees, and she'd seen exactly what he meant, immediately, the way you sometimes recognize a truth the moment someone else points at it. They'd talked for 2 hours. He was smart and certain and slightly abrasive in a way that felt, at 24, like passion. He had plans that took up the whole room when he talked about them. She liked that. She'd come from a family of careful people, people who kept their ambitions small to protect themselves from disappointment, and Adrian's refusal to do that felt like oxygen. She didn't understand yet that there's a difference between a man who dreams large and a man who expects other people to make those dreams affordable. The early years were thin. Adrian was still finishing his degree, then doing unpaid internships, then working for a firm in Tampa that paid him $38,000 a year and made him miserable. Amelia freelanced, took in design contracts, worked part-time at a print shop, and covered most of their rent without ever making it feel like she was covering rent. She told herself that's what you did when you believed in someone. You invested. You held the structure up while they built towards something better. She wasn't wrong, exactly. She just didn't understand what the return policy looked like. Adrian got his break in 2019, a commissioned mixed-use development in Coral Gables that a well-connected college friend threw his way. The project was modest, but Adrian executed it with a precision that got him noticed, and from there things moved fast. A Miami Beach hotel renovation, a private residence in Palm Beach that ended up in Architectural Digest, a profile in a regional business magazine with a photograph of him standing in front of the Coral Gables project, arms crossed, looking like he'd built the whole city. Amelia was in exactly none of the photographs. She didn't mind at first. She was behind the camera in a different sense, helping him select which project proposals to pursue, reviewing contract language with him late at night, managing the administrative side of his growing firm while he focused on the design work. She was good at it. She had a clear eye and a practical mind, and she could tell within 10 minutes of reading a proposal whether the client was serious or whether they were the kind of person who wanted a famous architect's name attached to a project and intended to argue about every budget line once the contracts were signed. He relied on her judgment completely, though he never said so. That should have been a sign. When a person uses your mind like a tool and never once acknowledges the hand holding it, they have already started to think of you as furniture. Worsam. Camille Rousseau appeared in their lives in the spring of 2022 at a fundraising event for a preservation nonprofit whose board Adrian had recently joined, more for the networking than for any particular feeling about historic buildings, Amelia suspected, though she kept that thought to herself. Camille was 29 and the daughter of a French shipping magnate who'd relocated to Miami in the 90s. She was tall in the particular way that made rooms arrange themselves around her without anyone deciding to do it. She had that smooth, expensive quality that comes not from beauty alone, but from a lifetime of being handled with care. Good schools, good doctors, good light in every room she'd ever occupied. She laughed easily and spoke 3 languages and wore her hair in a way that looked effortless and had probably taken 45 minutes. Amelia noticed the way Adrian stood differently when Camille was nearby. More erect, more deliberate, like a man remembering that he was supposed to be impressive. She didn't say anything. She told herself she was imagining it. By the fall of 2022, she was not imagining it. She didn't find out through messages on his phone or lipstick on a collar. Things that happened in movies, and she supposed in the lives of people whose betrayals were at least dramatic enough to make sense of them. She found out because Adrian started being kinder to her, the specific, careful kindness of a man who has already decided something and is managing his guilt by not making the interim period more unpleasant than necessary. He brought her flowers on a Tuesday for no reason. He asked about her sculpture work, the clay pieces she'd been making in the spare bedroom, mostly for herself, because she'd long since let the design career become secondary to managing his, with a sudden attentiveness that felt like a man cataloging his regrets. She asked him directly in November, stood in their bedroom doorway on a Saturday morning while he was getting dressed for what he'd told her was a site visit, and said, "Are you sleeping with her?" He didn't flinch. That was the worst part. He stood there with his shirt half buttoned and looked at her with that mild, impatient expression and said, "Amelia, let's not do this today." "Then when?" "I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk about it." And he left for his site visit, or wherever he went. And she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time looking at the floor, understanding in the slow, terrible way that sometimes knowledge arrives that she had already known this for months and had simply been refusing to finish the thought. The divorce papers appeared on the counter 6 weeks later, presented with the same casual efficiency Adrian applied to project timelines. He'd clearly had them prepared in advance, which meant he'd gone to the lawyer while she was still under the impression they were working through something. The papers were already partially filled in. All she had to do was sign. "I want you to be comfortable," he said, which was the first genuinely kind thing he'd said to her in months, and which landed like a slap. "The settlement is fair. Paul reviewed it." Paul was his attorney, not hers. "You should have your own counsel look at it, obviously, but I think you'll find it's reasonable." "You think I'll find it's reasonable?" "Amelia." "Say what you mean, Adrian. For once in the last year, just say what you actually mean." He set his phone face down on the counter, a concession to the seriousness of the moment that she noted and resented simultaneously, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this conversation and was now slightly annoyed that she wasn't following the script. "I need something different," he said. "My life has changed. The circles I move in now, the clients, the events, the expectations. Camille understands that world in a way that's natural to her. It's not a judgment of you, it's just compatibility." "Compatibility. We grew in different directions." "You grew," she said quietly. "I held the ladder." Something crossed his face. Not guilt, not quite, but something adjacent to it, a brief flicker of something he immediately decided not to feel, and then it was gone, and he was picking up his phone again. "The settlement is fair," he repeated. "Paul made sure of it." Well, she didn't sign the papers that night. She put them in her leather bag, the battered one she'd carried since grad school, dark brown, one broken clasp repaired with a safety pin, alongside her wallet, her phone charger, and a clay sculpture she'd been working on for weeks. A piece she'd never quite finished, a small figure curled around itself that she couldn't look at and couldn't bring herself to leave behind. She drove north on I-95 at 11 o'clock at night, with the rain coming down in sheets and the wipers barely keeping up, and the radio off, because every song that came on felt designed to destroy her. Somewhere around Fort Pierce, the car started shaking. She knew that shudder. She'd felt it before, had been meaning to take the car in, had put it off because there was always something else that needed attention first, some other logistical emergency in the maintenance of Adrian Vale's life. By the time she pulled onto the shoulder, the engine was making a sound that told her with absolute certainty that she wasn't going anywhere. She sat there with the hazard lights blinking orange in the rain and thought, "This is the lowest this gets. It has to be." She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. She was still in the car 20 minutes later when the motorcycles appeared in her rearview mirror. Not one or two, many, a long line of headlights coming through the rain like something out of a fever dream, the sound of the engines low and steady beneath the storm. She watched them in the mirror, uncertain whether to feel relieved or more frightened, and then the lead bike slowed and pulled onto the shoulder ahead of her, the others fanning out behind. The man who got off of the lead motorcycle was not what she would have expected, though she couldn't have said what she expected. He was somewhere north of 40, broad through the shoulders, moving with the particular economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion. The rain hit him like he hadn't noticed it was raining. He wore a black jacket with a patch on the left chest, Iron Hallow MC, and beneath it, Savannah. And when he reached the window and she rolled it down, she saw a face that had been through enough weather, both literal and otherwise, that the rain was genuinely irrelevant. "Car dead?" he said. "Engine. I've been meaning to get it looked at." He glanced at the hood, then back at her. His eyes were a gray-brown color, not quite either, and they had the quality of eyes that had seen enough that they'd stopped performing reaction for other people's benefit. "You got somewhere to be?" "No," she said, which was the first honest answer she'd given to any question in approximately 18 months. He studied her for a moment, not invasively, not the way men sometimes looked at women stranded on roadsides, which she'd been quietly braced for, but with the straightforward assessment of someone trying to determine what kind of situation they were actually dealing with. "We can get your car towed in the morning," he said. "Tonight you can come with us, or you can wait here. Your call." Behind him, the line of motorcycles sat idling in the rain, headlights illuminating the wet asphalt in long cones. Nobody got off their bikes. Nobody seemed impatient. They were waiting in the specific way that suggested they were accustomed to their leader making decisions that took as long as they needed to take. "Where are you going?" she asked. "South of Savannah. Few hours." She looked at the dashboard, at the hazard lights still blinking, at the rain on the windshield. She looked at her leather bag on the passenger seat with the unsigned divorce papers inside it, and the small clay figure wrapped in a gas station receipt. "Okay," she said. He nodded, no visible surprise. "Knox Mercer," he said. "Amelia Cross." He looked at her once more, a look she'd replay later, trying to identify what it contained, arriving eventually at the conclusion that it was simply recognition, the look of someone who understood what they were seeing without needing it, explained. And then he went back to his motorcycle. She grabbed her bag and got out of the car. They put her on a bike with a man named Decker, who said exactly 6 words to her during the entire 3-hour ride, and those 6 words were, "Hold on, lean with me, okay?" She held on. She leaned with him. The rain eased around Daytona, and by the time they crossed into Georgia, the sky was doing something complicated with clouds. And the highway had that washed clean smell that comes after heavy rain, dark and mineral and slightly electric. She'd never been on a motorcycle before. She'd always considered them impractical. She'd had opinions about impractical things once. She wasn't sure she had opinions about anything right now. Black Hollow looked like a place that had decided to stop apologizing for itself about 40 years ago and had been at peace with that decision ever since. It sat on a county road outside a town called Carlisle, which wasn't on most maps and which consisted, as far as Amelia could tell in the dark, of a gas station, a closed diner, and approximately 400 people who minded their business with aggressive dedication. Black Hollow itself was a compound of sorts. A large garage with 3 bays, a roadside bar that occupied a converted barn, several outbuildings of uncertain purpose, and an equipment yard where motorcycles and truck frames and things Amelia couldn't identify in the dark sat in configurations that suggested ongoing projects abandoned at various stages. The bar was called the Hollow, and when Knox pushed open the door, the smell hit her immediately. Cigarette smoke and spilled beer and the specific warm reek of a wood stove working hard against the November cold, layered under something that might have been a cleaning product from the 1980s. The interior was long and low-ceilinged, rough-hewn beams overhead, and the walls were covered in things: photographs, patches, license plates, a dartboard, 2 TVs showing different sports, and several pieces of artwork that surprised her. Actual paintings, not prints, and at least one sculpture, a welded figure about 18 inches tall, standing in the corner of the bar with the quality of something made by someone who knew what they were doing. She looked at it for a long time. "Clara made that," said a woman behind the bar, who had red hair shot through with gray and the permanent, slightly exasperated expression of someone who had been managing other people's chaos for decades. "She doesn't come around much anymore. You want coffee or something with teeth in it?" "Coffee," Amelia said. The woman, whose name turned out to be Ruth, poured her a mug and didn't ask her any questions, which was the most welcome thing that had happened to Amelia in weeks. Shashina. Knox gave her a room in one of the outbuildings, a converted bunkhouse with 4 beds, 3 of which were empty, heat coming from a wall unit that worked after you hit it twice in the right place, and a window that looked out on the equipment yard. It wasn't a room you'd find in a magazine. The mattress had a history. The blanket was army surplus. She slept for 11 hours. She stayed because she had nowhere better to go, and because, after those first 48 hours, nobody suggested that she should. The bikers of Iron Hollow MC were not what the movies had taught her to expect. They were not, in the main, threatening or crude or performatively dangerous. They were mechanics and veterans and the occasional small business owner, men in their 30s and 40s, and some considerably older, and they operated within a structure that was immediately apparent even if its rules were never stated aloud. They worked. They maintained things. They kept the garage running, repaired vehicles for people in the surrounding county at prices that suggested community obligation rather than profit motive, and they were quieter, collectively, than Amelia would have predicted. Knox ran things, though ran wasn't quite the word. Held together was closer. He worked in the garage most mornings, could take apart an engine and reassemble it with the same focused efficiency he had applied to everything she'd seen him do, and he had a quality of stillness about him that she gradually understood was not peace, but control. Something had happened to him, she didn't know what yet, that had burned away whatever impulse most people had to fill silence with noise. He spoke when he had something to say. When he didn't, he didn't. She found out about Iraq from Ruth, who told her without fanfare one afternoon while they were restocking the bar's supply room. 2 deployments, Ruth said, handing her a case of beer to stack. Second one was bad. Lost 3 men in his unit. Doesn't talk about it. I figured he didn't. He doesn't talk about most things. Ruth looked at her sideways. But he doesn't offer rooms to people he hasn't looked at hard first, just so you know where things stand. She started sculpting again in her 3rd week at Black Hollow. Not because she'd decided to, but because she walked through the garage one afternoon and saw a pile of scrap metal in the corner, broken exhaust pipes, a cracked engine housing, several pieces of chassis frame stripped for parts, and her hands wanted it, just like that. The wanting arrived without announcement, the way it used to before she'd spent years managing someone else's ambitions. She asked Decker, who turned out to be the garage's primary mechanic, and a man of few words but no actual unfriendliness, whether she could work with the scrap. He looked at her for a moment. "You know how to weld?" "No?" He handed her a face shield. "I'll show you the basics. Don't touch anything in the 3rd bay." She was bad at it for the first 2 weeks. The welds were ugly, the joins were uneven. She burned through her work gloves twice and singed the sleeve of her jacket once. Decker corrected her without commentary, just adjusted her angle or her distance or her feed speed with his hand over hers, and went back to his own work. But something was happening in the pieces she was making. They were raw and imperfect, and they had the quality that her clay work sometimes had on good days, and that she couldn't reliably produce on command. The quality of looking like they'd been made by a specific person in a specific state of mind, not by the application of technique to a problem. She worked late into the nights, the garage empty except for her and the overhead fluorescence and the hiss of the welder, and sometimes she'd look up, and Knox would be at the loading dock door that faced the equipment yard, smoking, not watching her but not watching her either, the way you occupy a space when you're sharing it without making it a thing. She didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge that she'd seen him. It became a kind of routine. Set. One night in December, she was working on a piece she'd been circling for weeks. A figure in the process of standing up, weight still low, arms not quite extended, balance not yet achieved. And she burned through a weld 3 times in a row, and the metal warped, and she pulled off the face shield and sat on an overturned oil drum and stared at the floor. "You're fighting it," said Knox from the loading dock. She looked up. He'd come closer than usual, standing just inside the door with his arms crossed and his jacket open despite the cold. "What?" "The metal. You're treating it like it should do what you want. It's not going to do what you want. You got to figure out what it wants to do and make that the thing you meant." She looked at the ruined weld and then at him. "That's advice about welding?" "Or other things," he said, with the closest thing to dry humor she'd heard from him. "Depends on what you're thinking about." She laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, short and slightly surprised. And it sounded strange coming out of her, like a voice she hadn't used in a long time. Knox looked almost startled, just briefly, and then he looked away at the equipment yard and took a drag of his cigarette. "Try letting the bead follow the joint," he said. "Don't lead it." He went back to the loading dock. She put the face shield back on. By January, she had 7 completed pieces. They were strange things, part figurative, part abstract, constructed from the detritus of machines, and they had a coherence to them that surprised her when she lined them up and looked at them all at once. They looked like the work of someone who was angry and who had decided to make the anger useful. Ruth put one of them in the bar, just set it on the shelf above the back row of bottles without asking Amelia, who discovered it there one evening and stood looking at it for a long moment. "Seemed like it belonged somewhere people could see it," Ruth said. "You could have asked." "Could have." Ruth refilled a glass down the bar. "Would you have said yes?" Amelia thought about it. "Probably not. That's why I didn't ask." "What?" The man who changed everything arrived on a Saturday in late January when the bar was half full, and the wood stove was working hard against a cold snap that had turned the equipment yard to iron frost. He came in alone, which was unusual. Most outsiders who found their way to the hollow came with someone who knew someone. He was in his mid-60s, white-haired, wearing a field coat that had enough years on it to be either poverty or indifference to appearances, and he walked like a man with bad knees who'd decided not to let that be the most interesting thing about him. He ordered a bourbon at the bar and sat on a stool and looked around the room the way some people look at rooms, not socially, not casually, but with specific attention, the way you look when you're actually seeing things. He looked at the sculpture on the shelf above the bottles for a very long time. Ruth said, "Staring at that's free. Touching it'll cost you." The man looked at her with something like appreciation. "Who made it?" Ruth tilted her head slightly toward the back of the room, where Amelia was sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a notebook full of sketches. The man picked up his bourbon and walked over and sat down across from her without asking, which was either audacious or oblivious. He turned out to be neither. He was simply direct in the way that people sometimes get when they've lived long enough to find waiting for permission tiresome. "That piece," he said, indicating the shelf with a slight movement of his glass. "Did you make it?" "Yes." "What's it called?" She'd never named it. She looked at him. "I don't name things." He looked at her for a moment with clear, slightly too perceptive eyes. "Elias Beaumont," he said, and extended his hand. The name didn't mean anything to her. She shook his hand. "Amelia Cross." "What are you doing in a place like this, Amelia Cross?" He said it without condescension, genuinely curious, a man who asked questions because he wanted answers. Trying to figure that out, she said. He nodded slowly, like that was the right answer. Took a sip of his bourbon, looked at the sculpture again. There's a quality in that piece, he said. I don't mean technically, though technically it's interesting. I mean, there's a person in it, a specific person having specific feelings. I can't tell you the last time I saw something new that had that. She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. I have a project, he said, a campaign, and I've been looking for something that I cannot find in any of the obvious places, which is why I'm driving through rural Georgia at 63 years old, stopping at bars I find on county road signs. He looked at her again with those two perceptive eyes. I want to tell you about it. You can tell me to leave, either way. She looked at him for a moment. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up through the gaps in the barn boards, and from the garage, faintly, the sound of a radio someone had left on. Tell me about it, she said. He talked for 40 minutes. She listened without interrupting, which was something she'd always been good at and which Adrian had mistaken for passivity, and which was actually how she processed things, completely, carefully, before she decided what she thought. Elias Beaumont, it turned out, was a great many things she hadn't known when he sat down. He was the founder of Beaumont Holdings, a private luxury conglomerate that operated in interior design, architecture, fashion, and hospitality. He had more money than Amelia could readily conceptualize. He had no interest in what this was supposed to mean about him. His wife had died 4 years ago. His son had died 2 years before that, and he talked about both of these facts in the same tone, not flatly, but with the steadiness of someone who had processed grief to its bones and was now simply living with the skeleton. The project he described was, in his words, a response to 15 years of luxury marketing that had convinced people that aspiration meant erasure, smoothing out everything imperfect and difficult and real in favor of a surface that reflected back what people thought they were supposed to want. I want the opposite, he said. I want real. Not performed authenticity, which is its own kind of lie. Actual real, marks and scars, and the specific look of a woman who has been through something and come out the other side of it still standing. He looked at her. That's you. You don't know me. I know what I saw in that sculpture. He paused. And I know what I see in front of me, which is a woman who's been through something recent enough that it's still on her face. She thought about the coffee going cold on the marble counter. She thought about the car on the shoulder of I-95 and the rain and the line of headlights in the mirror. What would it involve? She asked. He told her. She didn't say yes that night. She walked him to his truck, a battered pickup, she noticed, which fit neither his wealth nor her assumptions, and shook his hand again at the door and said she needed to think about it. Of course, he said. I might say no. That's allowed. She stood in the cold and watched him drive away down the county road, his taillights disappearing around the curve. The equipment yard was silent. The frost on the ground caught what light there was and made it brittle and precise. Knox was leaning against the garage wall 20 feet away, smoking, and she'd known he was there for the last several minutes. You heard? She said. Some. She shoved her hands in the pockets of the oversized leather jacket she'd taken to wearing. It had belonged to some previous occupant of the bunkhouse. Too large for her, the sleeves past her wrists. What do you think? He smoked for a moment, looking at the county road where Beaumont's taillights had gone. I think, he said carefully, that you spent a long time making yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's life. He dropped the cigarette and put it out with his boot. Sounds like someone's offering you a different shape. She stood with that for a while in the cold. It scares me, she said, which was honest in a way she hadn't been about much in a long time. Knox looked at her. Good, he said. Scared means you know it's real. He went inside. She stood in the frost for another 10 minutes, looking at the cold sky and thinking about a clay figure that was still tucked in her leather bag, wrapped in a gas station receipt, still not quite finished. Then she went inside too. In the morning, she called the number on Elias Beaumont's card. Elias Beaumont's assistant called back 3 days after Amelia left the voicemail, and the first thing the woman said was, Mr. Beaumont would like to meet in Savannah, if that's convenient. He said to tell you there's no pressure, and that he means it, which he asked me to emphasize because apparently people don't always believe him the first time. Amelia was standing in the garage with a cup of Ruth's coffee and a half-finished weld she'd been staring at for 20 minutes. "Thursday works," she said. "Wonderful. He'll send a car." "I have a car." She paused. "I'll have a car by Thursday." She did, barely. Decker had sourced a replacement alternator and spent 2 days installing it, charging her less than cost and waving off her attempt to argue about it with the particular dismissiveness of a man who finds negotiation tedious. The car came back from the tow yard on Wednesday evening, smelling like must and old upholstery and the specific staleness of a vehicle that had sat on a shoulder in the rain. She sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes before starting it, hands on the wheel, thinking about the last time she'd been in it. The hazard lights, the rain, the 11 o'clock certainty that things couldn't get worse. She started the engine. It turned over without complaint. "Fixed," Decker said from the garage doorway. "You're a man of understatement," she said. "That's what my ex-wife said. Different context." It was the most personal thing she'd heard him say in 6 weeks. She chose not to remark on it, which she sensed was the correct response. And he went back inside, and she sat in the running car for another minute before turning it off and going to bed. Savannah in late January had the particular quality of a beautiful city that didn't feel the need to perform its beauty for you. The squares were empty in the morning cold, Spanish moss hanging silver and still from the live oaks, the old townhouses standing along the cobbled streets with their shuttered windows and peeling paint, and the dignified deterioration of things built to last by people who hadn't anticipated quite how long. Amelia drove in along the river road and took a wrong turn twice. She hadn't used GPS in weeks, and had apparently lost some basic navigation instinct, and arrived 12 minutes late at the address Beaumont's assistant had given her, which turned out to be not an office but a restaurant, closed for the morning, where Beaumont was sitting at a corner table with coffee and what appeared to be half a newspaper. He stood when she came in, which was old-fashioned and also apparently genuine. "You found it." "Eventually." She sat down across from him. "You said no pressure and then picked a place that required parking downtown." "That's fair." He sat. "The owner's an old friend. She lets me use the place before service when I need to talk to someone without being in an office. Offices make people perform." A server appeared, also apparently a friend of the owner. There was a warmth to the way she and Beaumont exchanged a few words, and brought Amelia coffee without being asked, which she appreciated. "You called back," Beaumont said. "I said I'd think about it. You also said you might say no." "I still might." She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. The restaurant had the comfortable chill of a room that had been heated but hadn't quite reached equilibrium yet. "I want to understand what you're actually asking, not the campaign description, the actual ask." He looked at her with those clear eyes that she'd decided were his most striking feature. Not sharp exactly, but honest. The eyes of someone who had stopped filtering his perceptions through what other people wanted to see. "All right," he said, "the actual ask." He leaned back slightly, the way people do when they're settling in for something true. "Beaumont Holdings has spent 30 years in the luxury space. We do it well. We've always done it well. But I've been watching for the last decade a particular kind of exhaustion set in the culture, in our clients, in the work itself. Everything we make has started to feel like it's designed for a photograph of itself rather than for actual human use. Does that sound familiar?" She thought of Adrian looking at the scale model at the open house 15 years ago and 1,000 miles south. "Yes," she said, "I want to build a campaign around the opposite principle, not roughness for its own sake. I'm not interested in fake grit. I've seen plenty of that, and it's just another kind of performance. I want to find people who have actually lived in their faces and hands, and who have something real to show for it, and I want to build something around them that tells a different story about what luxury means." He paused. "I believe luxury, at its actual root, means having enough. Enough security, enough time, enough space, to become the person you actually are, not the person you perform." She turned the coffee mug in her hands. "And you want me to be the face of that?" "I want you to be one face of it. There are others. But yes, you specifically, because of that sculpture, and because of what I saw when I sat down at your table. You're not performing anything right now. Most people I meet, I can see them performing within the first 30 seconds. You're not." "I'm not performing because I don't have the energy," she said. "That's not the same thing as being authentic." "I'd argue it's exactly the same thing," he said. Authenticity isn't a character trait. It's what happens when a person's resources are too depleted to maintain the mask. She sat with that for a moment. What does the campaign involve? She said. Specifically. He told her it was more than she'd understood from his description in the bar. Not just print advertising, but a multi-platform project that Beaumont was framing as part editorial, part cultural statement. There would be photography, film, an installation component he was still developing. The campaign would run in a dozen publications across the United States and Europe, and there was discussion of a broader exhibition component in New York in the fall. The face of it, the person Beaumont called the anchor, would need to be available for a significant amount of work over the next 6 to 9 months, including time in New York, possibly Chicago, possibly London. I'm not a model, she said. I know. I've never done anything like this. I know that too. He didn't say it dismissively. I'm not looking for someone who knows how to do this. I'm looking for someone who will do it the way only they can. She looked out the restaurant's front window at the empty square across the street, the oak trees dropping long shadows on the cold cobblestones. My sculptures, she said. Would they be part of it? That's actually what I'd like to build it around, yes. He leaned forward slightly. The work you're making, and I'd like to see more of it if you're willing, has a quality I haven't seen in a very long time. It looks made by a specific human being who was feeling specific things. That's rarer than you might think. She thought about the nights in the garage, the hiss of the welder, the scrap metal reconfiguring itself under her hands into things she hadn't planned. She thought about Knox at the loading dock, smoking, watching without watching. I need to think about it more, she said. Of course. I'm not saying no. I know, he said, and something in the way he said it suggested that he'd been fairly certain she wasn't going to say no. Not because he was arrogant, but because he had some experience reading rooms, and the room in this case was a woman who'd come to Savannah in a car her mechanic had just fixed, and who was sitting across from him without performing anything. And that was already a kind of answer. She drove back to Black Hollow and found Knox in the third bay of the garage, doing something involved to a motorcycle engine, tools arranged on a cloth beside him with the neatness of someone who'd learned to care about the organization of small things. She stood in the bay doorway and told him about the meeting, not everything, but the shape of it, and he listened without looking up from the engine. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What's stopping you? He said. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not a public person. I've never been... She stopped. I've always been someone's background person. I don't know how to be the person in the foreground. He looked up then, setting down the tool he'd been holding. You built that figure in the corner of the bar in 2 weeks, out of scrap pipe and an engine housing, he said. You didn't know how to weld 4 weeks ago. That's different, is it? She leaned against the door frame. Outside, the frost had mostly gone, leaving the yard with the gray-brown look of January ground that wasn't quite ready to become anything else yet. He wants to put my face on billboards, she said. Whose face would you rather they put up? She laughed again, that short, slightly surprised sound that kept catching her off guard. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. He picked the tool back up. You mean your ex-husband spent 10 years making you feel like you didn't look right for the life he was building, and now someone wants to tell you the opposite and you don't trust it. The accuracy of it landed in her chest in a specific, unpleasant way. Yes, she said, because there wasn't much point in arguing. That's his damage, Knox said, without particular emphasis, the way you state a fact about weather. Doesn't mean it belongs to you. He went back to the engine. She stood in the doorway for another minute, then went to the garage workshop and started working on the sculpture she'd been circling for a week. The figure in the process of standing, weight still low, balance not yet achieved. This time she let the bead follow the joint instead of leading it. The weld came out clean. She called Beaumont the next morning and said yes. What followed was 6 weeks of a controlled chaos she had not anticipated, which was partly her own fault for not asking better questions during the Savannah meeting, and partly just the nature of something being much larger in execution than it appears in description. Beaumont's team, a New York-based creative director named Sasha Park, a photographer named Gideon Trace who had shot campaigns for publications Amelia had read for years, and a logistics coordinator named Marcus who communicated exclusively in bullet points and appeared to run entirely on espresso, descended on Black Hollow in early February with equipment and ideas and a level of professional confidence that was either inspiring or terrifying depending on the day. Sasha was the one Amelia dealt with most directly. She was 35, Korean-American, razor-efficient, and had the particular quality of someone who was excellent at her job and slightly skeptical of everyone else's ability to do theirs, which Amelia recognized because she'd had the same quality herself, once, before she'd spent a decade subordinating it. "I want to understand something first," Sasha said, on the first day, sitting across from Amelia at a table in the hollow while Gideon walked around the bar taking light readings with a meter. "Are you comfortable with this?" "Define comfortable." "This is going to be significant. The reach of this campaign is going to be large. Your face is going to be in places. People are going to have opinions." "I know. Elias told me you just went through something." She said it carefully, not with false delicacy, but with genuine consideration. "I don't need to know what. I just need to know that you're doing this because you want to, not because you don't have another option at this exact moment." Amelia looked at her. She appreciated the directness. "I want to," she said. "I don't fully know what I want yet, but this is part of figuring it out." Sasha nodded, satisfied with the honesty of that. "Okay, that works." They shot for 4 days at Black Hollow. Amelia with her sculptures, Amelia in the garage, Amelia in the hollow at various hours of the day with the light changing, Amelia outside in the equipment yard with Harleys lined up behind her like a landscape. Gideon Trace was quiet and specific and never asked her to smile, which she respected. He seemed to understand that he was photographing something real, and that his job was not to arrange it into beauty, but to find where the beauty already was and point the camera at it. The bikers were present throughout, most of them going about their business with the dignified indifference of people who found cameras aimed at other people's business perfectly reasonable. Decker told Gideon once, firmly and without hostility, not to photograph him, and Gideon said, "Of course," and moved on. Knox was the hardest to read. He was simply present, as he always was, and Amelia caught him in the background of one shot that Gideon showed her on the camera screen, standing near the garage door in the middle distance, not looking at the camera, expression unreadable. "I like that one," Gideon said. "He's not part of the campaign," Amelia said. "I know, it's just a good photograph." He scrolled past it. The campaign was scheduled to launch in April. In the weeks between the Black Hollow shoot and the launch, Amelia spent 3 days in New York for additional work, a studio shoot with Gideon that added a different visual register to the project, a meeting with Beaumont's editorial partners at a publication whose name she'd known her entire professional life, and at which she'd once submitted freelance work and received a form rejection. Nobody at the meeting knew about that, which she found quietly amusing. New York was difficult in the specific way cities are difficult when you've spent 3 months living inside something quiet and slow. The noise hit her differently. She felt the particular compression of a place where everything is happening simultaneously, and she moved through it with a wariness she hadn't expected to feel. She stayed 2 nights in a hotel Beaumont's team booked. The first night she ordered room service and called Ruth. "How's it going?" Ruth said. "Strange, they treated me like I was someone." "You are someone. You know what I mean." "I do," Ruth said. "That's still true." She slept badly both nights and was glad to drive back south. Adrian Vale called in the first week of March. She almost didn't pick up. She was in the garage workshop in the middle of a weld, and his name appearing on her phone screen after almost 3 months of silence had the specific unreality of something you've been unconsciously dreading without admitting it. She let it ring. Then she pulled off the face shield, set down the welder, and called him back. "Amelia." His voice was the same. That was annoying. She'd half hoped it would sound different, diminished somehow, but it was still the voice she'd spent 10 years listening to in the dark, and her body had its own memory of it that her mind couldn't fully override. "Adrian, I heard..." He stopped, started again. "Someone told me you're doing a campaign for Beaumont Holdings." "Who told you that?" "The architecture world is small. Someone saw the announcement." Another pause. "Is it true?" "Yes." A silence. She could hear him breathing, that particular pattern of breath that meant he was recalibrating. Adrian was someone who always needed a moment when information arrived that didn't fit his existing model. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," he said. "You're calling 3 months later to check if I'm okay." "I know the timing is—" "I'm fine," she said. "Is that what you called to ask?" "I also—" He stopped again. She waited. "The settlement," he said. "You haven't signed." "No." Amelia, at some point you need to—" "I know what I need to do, Adrian." She said it quietly, without heat, which she suspected was more unnerving to him than anger would have been. "I'll deal with it when I'm ready. Paul is your lawyer, not mine." She picked up the face shield from the workbench, turned it over in her free hand. "I have to go. I'm in the middle of something." "What are you working on?" She thought of what Knox had said, two damaged survivors recognizing each other's wounds. She thought of the scrap metal and the hiss of the welder and the 7 completed pieces lined up in the workshop and the 8th one in progress that she was starting to think might be the best thing she'd ever made. "Work," she said. "Goodbye, Adrian." She hung up. She stood still for a moment, hand on the phone, waiting to feel something particular, grief or anger, or the old pull of the life she'd had. What she felt was mostly tired, and beneath the tired, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. She put the face shield back on and finished the weld. The campaign launched on a Tuesday in April, and by Thursday Amelia's face was on a billboard in Times Square. She found out from a text message. Sasha sent a photograph without preamble, just the image and a single line. "It's up." The billboard was large in the particular way that Times Square things are large, which is to say it occupied a scale that didn't correspond to anything in regular human experience. The photograph was one Gideon had taken in the equipment yard at Black Hollow, Amelia in the oversized leather jacket, slightly turned, the Harleys and the winter gray sky behind her, and her face in three-quarter view with the particular expression she'd had during that shoot when Gideon had said, without instruction, "Just look at something you're thinking about." And she'd looked at the far fence line of the yard and thought about the divorce papers in her leather bag and the clay figure still not quite finished. That expression. Sasha had written a single line of text for the billboard that ran beneath the image. The real thing, finally. She showed it to Ruth, who looked at the photo on Amelia's phone for a long time and then said, "Well, he got you right." She showed it to Knox that evening, standing in the equipment yard in the cold. He looked at the screen without expression for a moment, then looked at her. "How does that feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Terrifying," she said, "and also like something I didn't know I needed to see." He handed her phone back, looked at the sky briefly, that particular way he had of looking at things that weren't the thing he was thinking about. "Adrian seen it?" "Almost certainly." "Good," Knox said, and that was all he said, and it was sufficient. The response was faster and larger than Beaumont had projected, which was saying something because Beaumont had projected a substantial response. The campaign broke through what Sasha called the attention ceiling, the point at which something stops being advertising and becomes a thing people are talking about on their own. Social media did what it always did, amplified and distorted and commented and argued, but the core of it was real. Women who had been in similar places to where Amelia had been, who recognized something in the photograph that they could not have named, but which hit them with the precision of something they'd been waiting to see. Letters came into Beaumont Holdings, hundreds of them, then more. Women who had been discarded by men they'd carried. Women who had rebuilt something from the leftover parts. Women who had been told they no longer fit the life that their labor had built. Sasha called and read Amelia some of them over the phone, and Amelia sat on the edge of the bunkhouse bed in the room she'd been sleeping in for 3 months, and listened and was quiet for a long time after. "This is what Elias knew," Sasha said. "He sees these things before they happen. It's his specific weirdness." "It's not about me specifically," Amelia said. "I'm just the shape they're hanging it on." "That's not quite right," Sasha said. "People can tell when something is real. That's the whole point." Adrian's collapse didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't in any straightforward sense caused by the campaign, though the timing was what it was, and the internet draws its own lines regardless of what actually connects to what. His firm had been showing stress fractures for months. A high-profile project in Miami that had run 60% over budget, a partnership dispute that had become public in the worst possible way, two senior architects who had left within 6 months of each other. The Coral Gables project that had launched him had also, it turned out, generated a lawsuit from a contractor he'd underpaid and then attempted to blacklist. And that lawsuit had been quietly moving through the courts for 2 years, gathering documentation. Amelia knew some of this from the general background noise of a world she'd spent a decade embedded in, and some of it from Sasha, who had a comprehensive understanding of the architecture world's gossip ecosystem, because Beaumont Holdings intersected with it constantly. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was the larger thing underneath it all, the thing that Elias Beaumont had been quietly assembling for 2 years, the thing that had to do with his son. She was working in the garage on a Thursday evening in late April, the weather finally breaking into something that could be called spring. The workshop door opened to the yard when she heard the sound of a car on the county road moving too fast and turned to see headlights swinging into the Black Hollow Drive. Not a motorcycle. A car she recognized. Adrian's car. She set down the welder carefully. She pulled off the face shield. She stood in the center of the workshop and breathed for a moment, and then she walked out into the yard. He was out of the car before it had fully stopped, which was not like him. Adrian Vale moved with considered deliberateness as a matter of personal presentation. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was wearing a jacket she recognized, one she'd picked out for him at a store in Coconut Grove 3 winters ago, and the irrelevance of that memory irritated her. Amelia. He was crossing the yard toward her, and there was something in his movement that was not quite desperation, but was close enough to it that she felt the old reflex, the instinct to reach out and help, the instinct that had organized her life for a decade, fire in her chest before she could stop it. She didn't move. He stopped about 10 feet from her. In the light from the workshop door, she could see his face clearly, and what she saw was a man who had been running at full speed toward a wall for months and had only just understood that the wall was real. "You need to stop this," he said. "Stop what?" "The campaign, whatever you're doing with Beaumont." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized, the gesture he made when he was genuinely rattled rather than performing rattled. "You don't understand what it's doing. Every interview, everything you say, people are connecting it to me. I'm getting calls. My clients are... Adrian, I'm serious. This is damaging me in ways that go beyond... Adrian." She said it more firmly. "I haven't said your name in a single interview. I haven't described you, implied you, or referenced our marriage in any public context. I signed a confidentiality provision in the settlement negotiation, which you know." She looked at him. "What are people connecting to you is their own conclusions. I can't control what people conclude." "You know what they're concluding." "Yes," she said. "I imagine they're concluding that behind every woman who looks like that on a billboard, there's probably a story." He stared at her. She'd seen him angry before, controlled anger, the kind he wielded strategically. But this was less controlled. Something underneath his usual management of himself was showing, and it made him look, paradoxically, more like the person she'd loved once and less like the person he'd decided to become. "I made a mistake, he said. "Amelia, I know I did. I made a significant mistake, and I..." "Don't," she said. "I'm not just saying, but don't." She said it the way you say a word when it is the only word in the sentence, when the whole weight of what you mean is in the single syllable. Whatever you came here to say next, don't say it, not because I'm angry, because I don't need to hear it. He stood there in the yard with the spring night around them and the sound of the bar going. Music and voices filtered through the barn boards, and from the garage the sound of a radio. "Then what do you need?" he said, and she could hear in his voice that he genuinely didn't know, that he was asking because he'd spent months looking for what she needed so he could calculate whether providing it would solve his problem, and had finally run out of calculations. "Nothing from you," she said. "That's the whole thing, Adrian. I don't need anything from you." He stood there for a moment longer. She watched him understand it. Not all of it. She didn't think he was capable of all of it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. It wasn't cruelty. It was just the specific limitation of a man who had organized his life around being needed, but enough of it that something in his posture shifted. Behind Amelia, she heard the workshop door open wider. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Adrian's eyes moved past her and stopped. Knox was standing in the doorway, not advancing, not performing, just standing there with his arms loose at his sides, and the specific quality of his stillness was the kind that communicates without effort, the way mountains communicate scale simply by existing. Adrian looked at Knox for a moment. Then he looked back at Amelia. She saw it happen. The recalculation, the rapid assessment of a situation he had walked into without fully understanding. And beneath that, something she hadn't expected, recognition. Not of Knox specifically, but of what the whole scene meant. What it said about where Amelia was now and what she was surrounded by and how entirely differently her life was arranged than it had been when he'd slid the papers across the marble counter 4 months ago. He took a breath. He straightened the collar of his jacket, that unconscious gesture, the presentation reflex, and he looked at her one more time. "The papers," he said. "When you're ready." "I know," she said. He got back in the car. She watched his taillights go down the county road and disappear at the curve. She stood in the yard for a minute. The night was cooler than the afternoon had promised, the way spring nights still sometimes were, and the air smelled like wet earth and the exhaust of the departing car. And underneath both of those, the metal and oil smell of the garage. "You okay?" Knox said from the doorway. She thought about it. "Yes," she said, and the strange thing was that it was true, and the strangeness of it being true was something she was still getting used to, the specific disorientation of being all right when you'd spent so long being otherwise. She turned around and went back into the workshop and picked up the welder. The piece she was finishing, the figure in the act of standing, weight rising, balance almost but not quite there yet, needed 2 more hours of work. She put on the face shield and got back to it. Outside, the county road was empty, and the spring night was doing what spring nights do, sitting on the boundary between one thing and another, not quite winter and not quite warm, holding the in-between. The way only living things know how to hold it, not comfortably, but stubbornly, with the specific determination of something that has decided it is going to make it to the other side, regardless of how long the crossing takes. The figure sold for $47,000. Not the original. Amelia hadn't put the original anywhere. It was still in the workshop, wrapped in a drop cloth in the corner, and she wasn't ready to talk about why she couldn't let it go. But Beaumont had asked in late April whether any of her Black Hollow pieces were available for the campaign's companion exhibition, a curated show he was mounting in a gallery space in Chelsea as a parallel event to the advertising launch. And she'd said yes to 6 of the 7 completed pieces, and the 7th, the figure in the process of standing, she'd cast in bronze through a foundry in Savannah that Sasha had found, producing 3 editions. And one of those editions had been included in the exhibition, and a collector from San Francisco had purchased it on the opening night for $47,000. Sasha told her by phone at 11 o'clock at night with audible satisfaction. "First piece sold in the first hour," she said. "The other 2 editions are already drawing interest." Amelia was sitting on the step outside the bunkhouse, her back against the door, boots on the gravel. The night was warm enough now that she didn't need a jacket. May had finally arrived in Georgia with actual conviction. And the equipment yard was lit by the security light above the garage door, casting long shadows between the parked bikes. $47,000, she said. "Yes, for something I made out of broken exhaust pipe." "For something you made," Sasha said. "The material is beside the point." She sat with the number for a moment. It was more money than she'd earned in any single year during the early part of her marriage. It was more money than Adrian had made in his first 3 years as a practicing architect. She didn't find satisfaction in those comparisons precisely, but she noticed them, the way you notice a bruise when it stops hurting, present, specific, no longer acute. "Elias wants to talk to you about the exhibition," Sasha said. "There's been interest from a second venue, Chicago, possibly, and New York wants to extend. I'll call him tomorrow. One more thing." A pause that had something deliberate in it. "Adrian Vale's name has come up in connection with the coverage." Amelia said nothing, waiting. "There was a piece in an architecture industry newsletter. Not a major publication, but it gets read by the right people. It drew a line between his career trajectory and yours. Who built what, who supported what, who got the credit. It was careful. It didn't make accusations. It just laid out a timeline. I didn't talk to anyone. I know. I know you didn't. Someone did their own research. Sasha's voice was measured, the tone of someone delivering information while withholding editorial. The piece is getting picked up. Bigger outlets are asking questions. Amelia looked at the security light above the garage. A moth was doing its determined, futile orbit around the bulb. I can't control that, she said. No, Sasha said. I just wanted you to know it was happening. She stayed on the step for a while after she hung up, listening to the sound of the bar. Muffled now, it was late enough that the crowd had thinned, and the far-off sound of a truck on the county road. The air smelled like cut grass from somewhere, and the perpetual garage smell of oil and metal that she'd stopped noticing weeks ago. The way you stop noticing a smell when it becomes the smell of home. The word surprised her when it arrived. She hadn't called it that, consciously, in her head, but it was what it was. Knox was in the equipment yard when she finally went back inside, sitting on the step of one of the older bikes, not his own, one that had been in long-term repair since before she arrived, with a can of something and his jacket off despite the night air. He spent evenings this way sometimes, and she'd learned it was not an invitation to conversation but also not a prohibition against one. She sat down on the overturned equipment box she'd been using for weeks as a general-purpose perch. First piece sold, she said. He looked over. How much? She told him. He looked at the number for a moment with his face doing the specific thing his face did when he was processing something significant. No visible change, but a quality of arrival, like a door opening somewhere you couldn't see. Decker's going to be insufferable, he said. Decker? He told the guys in February you were going to be somebody. There was a discussion about it. He took a drink from the can. He won $20. She stared at him. You all bet on whether I was going to... Not whether, just when. She sat with that for a moment. There was something in it she couldn't quite name. Not embarrassment, not quite. The feeling of having been seen before you knew you were visible. When did you know? She said. He looked at the equipment yard for a moment before answering. The night I met you on the road, he said. You got out of that car in the rain and grabbed that bag like the only thing that mattered was in it. Not like you were leaving something behind. She thought of the clay figure wrapped in the gas station receipt. I was leaving something behind. Right, but you weren't looking at it. He set down the can. You were looking forward. You just didn't know it yet. She didn't have an answer for that. They sat in the equipment yard for a while without talking, which had become, she realized, one of the things she'd grown most accustomed to at Black Hollow. The specific comfort of silences that didn't need to be filled. Chicago came together over 3 weeks in early May, through a series of phone calls and emails, and one in-person meeting in Atlanta that Beaumont drove up for, arriving again in his battered pickup that continued to confuse people who knew how much money he had. The exhibition was expanding. What had started as a companion piece to the advertising campaign had taken on its own momentum, separate from it. Galleries were calling Sasha directly. A curator at a museum in London had made an inquiry, and an editor at a major arts publication had reached out about a long-form profile of Amelia. The advertising campaign was doing what campaigns do, but the artwork was doing something different. The slower and more lasting thing that happens when work connects with people at a level that commerce can't entirely account for. Beaumont told her all of this in Atlanta over lunch, in the same direct way he told her everything, without inflation. I want to be honest with you about something, he said, midway through the meal. You usually are. There's a business component to this that I want you to understand clearly. He set down his fork. The campaign has exceeded every metric we set. That's good for Beaumont Holdings. It's also good for you, commercially, in ways that your representation, when you have representation, will want to maximize. There are going to be offers. Brand deals, licensing, speaking engagements, the whole structure. I don't have representation. I know, you should. He looked at her with those clear eyes. I can give you names. People I trust, which is a short list, but they're on it. She turned her coffee cup. You're telling me this is about to get more complicated. Significantly more. He paused. The question I'd like you to think about is what you actually want from it. Not what's logical or strategic, what you want. She considered it. I want to keep making things, she said. Everything else I'm still figuring out. That's the right answer, he said. Everything else we can build around that. She looked at him across the table. This 63-year-old man with his bad knees and his field coat and his clear, grief-seasoned eyes, and thought again about how thoroughly he defied the shape she'd expected him to have. Why are you doing this? She asked. Not the campaign. This. Sitting across from me in Atlanta, giving me advice you don't have to give. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she understood the question had landed somewhere real. My son, he said, was an artist. Sculptor, actually, which is part of why I walked into that bar. His medium was different. He worked in glass, large-scale installation work. He was extraordinary. He paused. He died 6 years ago. He was 31. She waited. He spent the last 3 years of his life fighting to get his work seen, Beaumont said. The art world is not friendly to people who don't already have access. He had the work. He didn't have the doors. He looked at his coffee. I had the doors. I was too busy building the company to open them for him. That's the simple version. The restaurant was quiet around them. Someone across the room laughed at something, and the sound landed in the space between them with the slight wrongness of a sound in the wrong key. The campaign, he said, is partly business. I won't pretend otherwise. But the part that isn't business is this. I know what it looks like when someone has the real thing and the world can't see it yet. My son had it. He died without most people knowing. He looked at her. You have it. I'd like to not make the same mistake twice. Amelia sat with this for a long time. I'm sorry about your son, she said. Thank you. He picked up his fork. Don't be sorry for long. He'd have found it maudlin. She smiled despite herself. She came back to Black Hollow in the afternoon and went directly to the workshop without stopping at the bar, which was how she handled most things that had shifted something large inside her. She processed with her hands, with the metal and the heat, rather than with words. She worked until late, and when she came up for air it was nearly midnight and Knox was at the loading dock. Long day, he said. It wasn't a question. Beaumont told me about his son. She wiped her hands on a rag. He was an artist, sculptor. Knox said nothing, but he was listening. He had a reason for this whole thing that I didn't know about. She leaned against the workbench. It changes the feeling of it. Makes it heavier? Makes it more real. She looked at the current piece, a new one, 3 figures in different positions, interconnected but not touching. He opened those doors because he couldn't open them for his son, and that's something I carry differently than a business deal. Knox smoked for a moment. You carry it like it belongs to you now, he said. That's not the wrong way. She looked at him. In the months since November, she'd constructed a tentative understanding of Knox Mercer from the things he said and the things he very deliberately didn't say, from the way he ran Black Hollow and the way the men around him behaved, and the way he stood at loading dock doors in the middle of the night, watching a woman weld broken machine parts into something that wasn't broken. She'd understood fairly early that what she felt around him was not what she'd felt around Adrian, not the pull of someone who needed her, not the satisfaction of being indispensable to someone else's momentum. It was something quieter and more unsettling, the way you feel in a place you recognize without knowing why. She wasn't ready to say that. She was barely ready to think it. I need to go to Chicago next month, she said, for the exhibition. I know. I'll be gone about a week. He nodded, looking at the yard. Decker's going to keep your space in the workshop. I wasn't worried about my space. I know, he said. I was just filling the silence. She laughed. Again that short reel sound, the one that still caught her off guard. You never fill silence, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, slightly. Special occasion, he said. Chicago in June was a different world from rural Georgia. The city hit her with the specific kinetic force of a place that had organized itself around motion and noise and the permanent sense of things happening faster than you could track them. She'd been to Chicago before years ago for an architecture conference she'd attended with Adrian, where she'd managed his schedule and made his reservations and collected his business cards at the end of each day like a very skilled administrative assistant who happened to also be his wife. This time, she had her own hotel room on the 14th floor with windows facing the lake and a meeting schedule that said her name at the top. The gallery was in the West Loop, a converted industrial space with 20-foot ceilings and the bones of a building that had been a lot of things before it was a gallery. Sasha had been there for 2 days already, overseeing the installation, and when Amelia walked in on the Tuesday before the opening, she found the space half-hung and Sasha standing on a ladder arguing in a measured but firm voice with the lighting designer about the angle of a spot on the central piece, the bronze figure in the act of standing, now the anchor of the exhibition. Sasha climbed down when she saw Amelia. "It's almost right," she said. "The lighting's fighting the piece." Amelia walked to the center of the room and looked at the figure. It was the first time she'd seen the bronze in person. She'd approved the foundry's cast from photographs. And there was something disorienting about it, as there always was when a thing you'd made moved into the world and became something other people could stand in front of without you. It was hers, and also no longer hers, in the specific way that art works. You make it in private, and then you let it go, and it finds its own people. "Move the spot 15 degrees left," she said to the lighting designer, "and lower the intensity by about a third. It's competing with the negative space." The lighting designer looked at her, looked at Sasha, looked back at Amelia. "Trust her," Sasha said. She made it. The opening was Thursday evening. Beaumont flew in from New York, arriving at the gallery with 2 hours to spare and walking the space with the particular attention of someone who cared about the material reality of things, touching walls and looking at angles, before he found Amelia standing in the back corner reviewing the exhibition notes and came to stand beside her. "It's right," he said, looking at the central figure. "Almost," she said. "That's what right usually looks like." He had a glass of water. He'd told her in Atlanta that he'd stopped drinking after his wife died, which he mentioned without drama as a simple fact about himself. "How are you?" "Nervous," she said, which was honest. "There are going to be people here tonight that She paused. "I used to read about these people." "That's a strange feeling." "They're going to read about you," he said. "That's a stranger one. You might as well get used to it." The crowd came in at 7, the slow accumulation of bodies that art openings were. Collectors and critics, and people who came for the wine and stayed for the conversation, and people who came for the conversation and stayed for the art. Amelia moved through the room with the wariness of someone who had been invisible in social settings for so long that visibility felt like wearing the wrong clothes. Conspicuous, slightly itchy, not yet natural. A woman in her 60s stopped her near the central piece. She had the specific elegance of someone who'd been beautiful for so long it had stopped being the most interesting thing about her, and she looked at Amelia with an expression that Amelia couldn't read at first. "I recognize you," the woman said. "The billboard," Amelia said. "Before that." The woman tilted her head slightly. "You sat in the 3rd row at the AIA conference in Chicago in 2019. You organized the schedule for that architect, Vail, wasn't it? I remember because you were the one who actually knew everything that was happening, and he was the one who walked around accepting credit for it." Amelia stared at her. "I'm on the conference board," the woman said, not unkindly. "I notice the people who do the real work. It's a habit." She extended her hand. "Miriam Holt. I chair the Holt Foundation." Amelia shook it. "Amelia Cross. I know who you are." Miriam Holt looked at the central figure for a moment. "Is it true you made that from motorcycle parts?" "Exhaust pipe, engine housing, some chassis material." Miriam looked at it with an expression that resolved into something like decision. "I'd like to talk to you tomorrow. My foundation supports emerging artists, with particular emphasis on," she paused, "on people who've been doing the real work without the credit." She looked back at Amelia. "I suspect that's a conversation worth having." "I suspect so too," Amelia said. Later in the evening, near the sculpture she'd titled, Finally, at Sasha's gentle insistence, still rising, Amelia found herself in a conversation she hadn't expected and couldn't exit gracefully. The man was an architecture journalist, mid-40s, with the specific energy of someone who had been doing research on something and had found a thread he wanted to pull. "Your background is in design," he said. Graphic arts, primarily? My MFA, yes. I've done other things. You were married to Adrian Vale. He said it neutrally, a fact being offered rather than a blade. But it had blade potential, and she could feel it. I was. He's having a difficult year. She looked at him. I'm aware. There's a story going around, the journalist said, about a project he completed in 2020, a residential commission in Palm Beach. There are questions about the original concept drawings, whether they came from his practice or from somewhere else. She felt something shift in her stomach. She kept her face still. I don't have anything to say about Adrian Vale's practice. Of course. He nodded. I'm not suggesting you do. I just was wondering whether, in your time working alongside him, I supported his practice administratively, she said. I wasn't privy to the creative process, which was carefully true. She had been privy to a great many things, but the creative process was one of them only tangentially. And what she knew, she'd known imprecisely, impressionistically, the way you know things when you're adjacent to them rather than inside them. The journalist looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who could tell the difference between a closed door and a locked one. Of course, he said again. Thank you. He moved on. She stood by the sculpture for a moment with her wine glass not quite empty and thought about what he'd said. The Palm Beach project. She knew the one. Adrian had worked on it through most of 2019 and into early 2020, and there had been a period of several weeks when he'd been uncommunicative about the project's direction in a way that had been unusual for him, because he normally liked to talk through design decisions, liked having a smart audience while he thought out loud. During those weeks, he'd been quiet. She'd assumed it was a difficult client. She didn't know what she knew exactly, but she knew something. She finished her wine and went to find Beaumont. He was near the back of the gallery, talking to Miriam Holt and a man Amelia didn't recognize. But when she approached, he excused himself with the smooth ease of a man who'd been reading conversations for decades. Something's wrong, he said quietly when they were out of earshot. Not wrong. She looked at him. There was a journalist asking about Adrian, specifically about the Palm Beach project, origin of concept drawings. Beaumont said nothing, but his expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. A brief contraction, a pulling inward. Elias. She kept her voice low. Do you know something about the Palm Beach project? He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the gallery noise continued, voices and ice and glasses and shoes on the concrete floor, and he was a still point in the middle of it. Not here, he said. Then tomorrow. He looked at her. Yes, tomorrow. She nodded. She went back to the exhibition and spent the rest of the evening doing the work of being present, talking to collectors, answering questions about the pieces, standing in front of the central figure and explaining that, no, she hadn't planned what it would become. She'd just let the metal go where it wanted to go. Over and over she said some version of this, and each time she said it, she thought about Knox at the loading dock. Don't lead it, let the bead follow the joint. And there was something almost funny about the fact that the philosophy behind her best work came from a mechanic at a biker compound in rural Georgia who'd learned it fixing engines. She made a note to tell him that. He would not find it as funny as she did. He would look at the yard in the way he had and say something that would be actually true, and she would laugh, and he would almost smile. Beaumont came to the hotel the next morning, early enough that the lake was still doing the gray-silver thing it did before the sun found an angle on it. He sat in the chair across from the small table where she'd made terrible instant coffee from the room's supply and accepted a cup without comment. He told her about his son first, fuller than he had in Atlanta. Daniel Beaumont had been 31 when he died. An accident, a winter road, nothing dramatic and nothing meaningful. The senseless random event that grief always struggles to make sense of because sense is not available. Daniel had worked in glass installation, large-scale pieces, the kind that required structural engineering as much as artistic vision. He had also, in his 20s, done some architectural conceptual work, not as a career but as a way of paying rent during the periods between art commissions. He contracted with several firms in the late 2000s, Beaumont said. Concept development work. He was good at it. He had a spatial intelligence that architects recognized. He'd sign NDAs, develop concepts, get paid a flat fee, and the ideas would go into the firm's portfolio without his name on them. He looked at the window. He did this for 6 or 7 practices over about 4 years. It bothered me more than it bothered him. He was philosophical about it. He said the money allowed him to make the real work. Amelia turned her terrible coffee cup slowly in her hands. She already understood where this was going, but she let him get there in his own time. In 2019, Beaumont said Daniel contracted with Vale Architecture for concept development on a residential project. He told me about it, mentioned Vale's name, mentioned the Palm Beach location. It was a 6-week contract, flat fee, NDA. He delivered the concept package and was paid. He paused. Daniel died 14 months later. And the Palm Beach house was published, Amelia said quietly. Under Adrian Vale's name, yes, with no acknowledgement of any external concept work. He set down the coffee cup. I've known this for about 2 years. I've been trying to decide what to do with it for about 2 years. She sat with this. She thought about Adrian during those quiet weeks in late 2019, not talking about the project. She thought about his movements through the architecture world, confident, assured, the man who had built himself from nothing, the man she'd carried and believed in. She thought about what it meant for that entire story to have a footnote that he'd worked very hard to keep invisible. You came to Black Hollow looking for me specifically, she said. Or did you come looking for someone and find me? He looked at her directly. Both. I'd seen your name, connected to Vale's practice in industry contexts, and I came to Georgia because someone told me there was a sculptor worth looking at in an unlikely place. He paused. I didn't know who I'd find, but I knew what I was looking for. She nodded. She was angry and not angry. The anger was there, but it was at the right person, directed correctly, and it didn't splash onto Beaumont because she could see with reasonable clarity that he had been carrying something alone for 2 years and had made a decision about how to address it that she might not have made but could understand. What are you going to do about it? She said. That's partly your decision, he said. You were married to him. You're the person most immediately involved in. I'm not asking whose decision it is, she said. I'm asking what you're going to do. He looked at her. There's a journalist, he said, from the architecture trade press. He's been investigating Vale's practice for 8 months. He has documentation. Daniel's contract, correspondence, the concept package. He came to me 3 months ago and asked whether I wanted to be on the record before publication. And? I told him I needed time. You've had time, she said. I have. He looked at the lake out the window. What I needed was to be sure that what I was doing was about Daniel and about the truth, and not about other things. She understood what the other things were. He was telling her that he needed to be certain he wasn't weaponizing his grief, that he wasn't using his money and his access to destroy a man for reasons that were about pain management rather than accountability. That kind of self-examination took time and could not be rushed. Are you sure now? She said. I am, he said. I'm going to talk to the journalist. I'm going to go on record. He looked at her. I wanted you to know before it happens, because when it comes out, your name is going to be in the story. You were his wife. That's not avoidable. She breathed in through her nose and out slowly. The lake outside had found its morning color, a particular blue-gray with white on it from the wind. When? She said. A few weeks. He's completing his documentation. She nodded. Are you all right? He said. She thought about it honestly, the way Knox had taught her to sit with a question before answering it. She thought about Adrian sliding the papers across the marble counter. She thought about Daniel Beaumont, 31 years old, working in glass, signing NDAs so he could pay rent and make the real work. She thought about the concept drawings for a Palm Beach house traveling from a young artist's hands to a famous architect's portfolio without a name attached to them, without acknowledgement, without a door that anyone opened. I'm going to be all right, she said, which was slightly different from I'm all right. And Beaumont heard the difference and nodded. She called Knox that afternoon from a bench on the lakefront, the wind pulling at her jacket and the water doing its big and different thing in front of her. She told him what Beaumont had told her. All of it, in order, the way she'd learned to tell Knox things. Without embellishment, without the editorial she might have added for someone else's benefit, because Knox didn't need her to tell him how to feel about it. He would feel what he felt, and so would she, and that was acceptable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You okay? He said. Yeah, she said. Okay. A pause. The starter motor on your car is making a sound. She blinked. What? Decker noticed it when he moved it this morning. It'll need looking at when you get back. She sat on the lakefront bench in Chicago and felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. The specific sensation of being thought of in terms of the practical and the ordinary by someone who is paying attention to your actual life. After months of being the subject of photographs and campaigns and industry coverage, and her ex-husband's occasional panicked calls, Knox Mercer had called to tell her about her car. Thank you, she said. Drive safe coming back, he said. Those Georgia interstates get weird around Atlanta. I know. I know you know. A beat. Just drive safe. She stayed on the bench for a while after she hung up, watching a boat move across the far side of the lake, and thought about the specific shape of what was coming, the story that would break, the noise that would follow, the ways her name would appear in connection with Adrienne's and Daniel Beaumont's, and all the invisible labor that nobody had thought to document because nobody had thought it mattered. It was going to be ugly and complicated and real. She didn't want to go through it. She was going to go through it. She got up from the bench and walked back to the hotel to pack. She drove back from Chicago in a single push, 14 hours with 2 gas stops and a bad cup of coffee outside Nashville that she drank anyway, because the alternative was pulling over to sleep, and she didn't want to sleep. She wanted to move. The Atlanta interstates were exactly as weird as Knox had warned, a tangle of interchanges that rewarded attention and punished the distracted, and she navigated them with the focused blankness of a person who has too much to think about and has chosen, temporarily, to think about nothing except the road. She got back to Black Hollow at 2 in the morning. The bar was long closed, the equipment yard dark except for the security light, the bikes lined up along the gravel in the shapes she'd memorized without meaning to. She sat in the car for a moment after cutting the engine, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal, and thought about the fact that several months ago she'd sat in a different car on a Florida highway shoulder, listening to similar sounds and feeling like the bottom of everything. She got out, got her bag, and went to the bunkhouse. She was asleep inside of 6 minutes. The starter motor turned out to need a full replacement, which Decker handled in an afternoon with the cheerful pragmatism of a man who found mechanical problems more tractable than most other kinds. He charged her for parts only, as he had the last time, and she didn't argue because she'd learned that arguing with Decker about pricing was a particular category of futile that she'd stopped attempting 2 months in. Chicago good, he said, not looking up from the engine bay. Good and complicated. Usually the same thing, he said. He handed her a bolt to hold the way he did occasionally when he wanted an extra set of hands, without wanting to ask for them formally. She held it. Sasha called here looking for you. You not answering your phone? I was driving. She called here, he said again with a slight emphasis that suggested this was a commentary on the quality of the modern phone system and also possibly on Sasha. I'll call her back, he grunted. They worked in companionable silence for 20 minutes. Her holding things, him fixing things, until the engine bay was reassembled and he started the car and listened to the starter with his head slightly tilted, the posture of a man hearing something most people couldn't. Good, he said. Thank you, Decker. You should get the front left brake pad looked at, too. Not now, next month. I'll put it in this calendar, she said, knowing she wouldn't, knowing he knew she wouldn't, understanding that this was part of the rhythm of the place. He would remind her again in 3 weeks, without rancor. The article broke on a Wednesday morning in late June, published by an architecture and design journal that was small in the sense that its readership was specific rather than broad, but whose readership was precisely the people whose opinions moved the industry. The journalist's name was Carter Webb, and he'd been covering architecture for 15 years with the quiet tenacity of a person who believed the built environment was a moral statement and who had, in his time, made several people in the field uncomfortable by treating it as one. The piece was called The Blueprint Question, Concept Credit, and Creative Labor in Contemporary Architecture Practice. It did not mention Adrienne Vale in the headline. It did not need to. Sasha sent it to Amelia at 7 in the morning with a text that read, "It's out. Read it before you look at anything else." She read it at the kitchen table in the bunkhouse with coffee she'd made herself, Ruth not yet up, the early morning quiet of the compound around her. It was a long piece, Thoroughly documented, careful in the way of someone who had spent 8 months making certain every claim was airtight. And it told the story of Daniel Beaumont's contract work, the concept package, the Palm Beach house, and the discrepancy between the drawings in Vail Architecture's portfolio and the originals in Daniel's files, which Beaumont Holdings had retained after Daniel's death. Beaumont was quoted extensively. He spoke about his son in the clear, steady tone she'd come to recognize as his register for the things that cost him most. He spoke about the practice of concept outsourcing in architecture more broadly, the way young and emerging artists and designers were frequently brought in under NDA to do foundational creative work that then traveled, without credit, into established practices and portfolios. "It is not unique to Adrian Vail," he said in the piece. "It is a structural problem in the industry. Daniel's case is one I can speak to with documentation. I am speaking to it because documentation is available, and because the alternative is silence, and silence is what made this possible in the first place." Adrian was contacted for comment. His comment, 2 sentences, was at the bottom of the piece. "Vail Architecture has always adhered to proper professional standards in all project development. We have no further comment at this time." It was the comment of someone whose lawyer had written it. She read the piece twice. Then she sat with her coffee and looked at the bunkhouse wall. The old boards, the one photograph someone had tacked up years ago of a group of men on motorcycles in front of a desert landscape, sun-faded and anonymous, and felt the specific weight of having expected something and had it arrive and found it was still heavier than you'd prepared for. Ruth came in at 7:30, saw her face, poured herself coffee without comment, and sat across from her. "The article," Amelia said. Ruth had clearly already read it. "Yes. It's accurate," Amelia said. "Everything in it. I didn't know about Daniel specifically, but I knew there was something wrong about that project. She stopped. "You just didn't let yourself finish the thought," Ruth said, not unkindly. The statement of a woman who had watched herself not finish thoughts and had some perspective on the mechanism. "I believed in him," Amelia said. "For a long time I genuinely believed in him. And even when I stopped believing, I kept—" She looked at her coffee. "I kept the belief organized, like a storage unit, put it away and kept paying the rent on it because it was easier than emptying it out." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "That's what a decade looks like," she said. "It's not stupidity. It's investment. You don't write off 10 years easy. No. You doing okay?" "I don't know yet," Amelia said. "Ask me this afternoon." Much. By that afternoon, the piece had been picked up by 3 major publications. 2 architecture podcasts had announced they'd address it in upcoming episodes, and Adrian's name was trending on social media in the specific way that felt, Amelia imagined, like standing under a collapsed ceiling. Her phone was something she'd silenced and set face down on the workbench, checking it only every hour because the alternative was watching it in real time, and she didn't think that was good for her. The messages were a mix. Sasha with updates, Miriam Holt with a note of support that was brief and sincere. Her own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen she'd hired in April to finally handle the divorce settlement, checking in with the practical question of whether the current situation changed anything about the settlement timeline. It did, as it turned out. Patricia called in the early afternoon to explain that given the emerging public documentation of creative practice irregularities at Vail Architecture, there was a reasonable argument that intellectual contribution to the firm during the marriage had been materially undervalued in the current settlement terms. "I'm not saying we pursue that immediately," Patricia said, "but I want you to know it's on the table." "Note it," Amelia said. "Don't move on it yet." "Understood." "Are you all right?" "People keep asking me that." "It's a reasonable question under the circumstances." "I know," Amelia said. "I'll let you know when I have a cleaner answer." She went to the workshop after the call and worked for 4 hours without stopping, which was how she metabolized things that were too large to think about directly. She thought around them, through her hands, through the physical problem of the current piece, and let the larger things settle at its own pace. Knox came by at 5, leaned in the doorway, looked at the piece she was working on. "Carter Webb called here," he said. She looked up. "Why here?" "Couldn't get you on your phone, apparently." Ruth took the message. He held up a slip of paper. "He wants a comment from you, for a follow-up piece." She pulled off the face shield. What kind of follow-up? About the labor side of it. Your role in the practice. The infrastructure you built. He set the paper down on the workbench. His words. She looked at the paper. Carter Webb's number, Ruth's handwriting, precise and slightly old-fashioned. What do you think? She said. Knox looked at the piece she was working on. A new figure. This one with its arms extended, balance fully achieved, reaching forward rather than standing up. He looked at it for a moment with the quiet assessment he gave everything. I think, he said, you've been the footnote to somebody else's story for long enough. But she looked at the number. She looked at the piece. She thought about Daniel Beaumont, 31 years old, making his real work in the time between NDAs, never knowing that his concept drawings would end up in an Architectural Digest profile with someone else's name above them. I'll call him, she said. Sinkan. The follow-up piece ran 10 days later. It was shorter than the original, more personal in register. Carter Webb was good at shifting modes, and it focused less on the documentation of wrongdoing and more on the question the original piece had raised without fully answering. What does it look like when the person doing the structural work of building a career never appears in the public account of that career? Amelia had talked to Webb for 2 hours on the phone, carefully, with Patricia Chen listening on the call in a professional capacity. She'd been precise about what she knew and didn't know, about what she'd witnessed and what was inference. She hadn't been dramatic. She'd just told the truth about what it had looked like from inside. The proposal reviews, the contract readings, the client management, the years of organizing someone else's professional life while her own work sat in a spare bedroom. The piece quoted her once, a single paragraph that Webb had flagged specifically for her approval before publication. I don't think what happened to me is unusual. I think the specific way it happened to me, a woman spending years building the practical infrastructure of a man's career while he accumulates the credit and the reputation and the public identity, is one of the oldest and most ordinary stories in the world. The only thing that's different is that I'm in a position to say so out loud. When she read that paragraph in print, she felt something she didn't entirely expect. Not vindication. That word had always seemed too neat, too triumphant for the complicated thing she actually felt. It was more like the sensation of having set down something heavy and discovering that your hands still remembered the weight of it, that the absence was its own physical experience. Adrian called 4 days after the follow-up piece ran. It was 10 in the morning, and she was in the workshop, not working, just sitting on the oil drum and looking at the extended arms figure when his name appeared on the screen. She answered this time. You talked to Webb, he said. His voice was different than it had been in March in the equipment yard. The careful management was gone. What was underneath it, what she heard and had to consciously not feel responsible for, was someone in real distress. Yes, she said. Amelia. A pause. My firm. The partners are... There are conversations happening. 2 major projects have been put on hold. Clients are... I know, she said. Did you think about what this would do? Did you consider that... Adrian. She said it quietly, and something in her tone stopped him. She heard him stop, heard the breath he took. I'm going to say something, and I need you to actually hear it. She looked at the figure with its arms extended. I didn't do this to you. Carter Webb spent 8 months doing this because he believed it was true and important. Beaumont went on record because his son was owed that. I talked to Webb because the part of this story that's mine is mine to tell. You could have called me first. You could have warned. No, she said. I couldn't have, because if I'd called you first, you would have spent 2 days talking me out of it, and I would have spent those 2 days remembering every reason I used to put your needs above my own, and I would have let you. And that's over. Silence on the line, long enough that she thought for a moment he'd hung up. Daniel Beaumont, he said finally. His voice was different now, smaller, the particular sound of a man confronting something he's spent years not confronting. It wasn't my intention to... What was your intention? Another long silence. I needed the project to succeed, he said. I needed it to be extraordinary, and I was stuck. Daniel's approach was right in a way mine wasn't, and I told myself the NDA covered it, and I told myself that I'd improved on it enough that it was mine, and... He stopped. I knew it wasn't right. She sat with this. It was the first honest thing she'd heard him say about it, and it landed in her with a complicated weight. Not forgiveness, because this wasn't that conversation, but something like acknowledgement, the specific relief of having the thing be real instead of denied. Say that to Webb, she said. Say it to Beaumont. Say it to whoever Daniel's people are. It won't fix anything, she agreed. But it's still what you should do. He was quiet again. Amelia, he said. I know, she said. She didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but she knew the shape of it, and she knew that whatever it was, she didn't need to hear it right now. Maybe not ever. Get a good lawyer, Adrian, not Paul. Someone who will tell you the truth about where you are. She ended the call. She sat on the oil drum for a while longer. Then she went back to work. The gala was Beaumont's idea, or more precisely, it was his team's idea, and he'd agreed to it as a framework for an event he'd been planning to hold regardless. A Beaumont Holdings benefit in Chicago in late August that would serve as the official close of the campaign's public phase, and a launch for the foundation component that Miriam Holt had, in the 6 weeks since their conversation at the gallery opening, helped him design with striking speed. The Cross Beaumont Foundation. She'd argued against having her name on it. He'd argued back in the precise, patient way of a man who has considered the argument from all sides and arrived at a conclusion he was not going to move from. And she'd conceded because he was right, and she knew he was right. Would support emerging artists and veterans experiencing transition, with a particular focus on people working in non-traditional circumstances and materials, people who didn't fit the standard institutional pathways, because the standard institutional pathways had been designed for different people. Knox, when she described it to him, said, veterans. Yes, it was part of what Elias and I talked about, people who've done work that doesn't appear in any public record. That's soldiers as much as it's artists. Knox looked at the yard for a moment. He did that more in the evenings now, she'd noticed. Looked at the yard and the bikes and the compound in a slightly different way, not nostalgic exactly, but present in a way that was aware of itself. He said. That's all you've got? It's a good idea, he said. That's the High praise from Knox Mercer. Don't push it, he said, but the corner of his mouth moved. The Chicago Gala was held at the Beaumont Foundation's rented event space in the West Loop, 3 blocks from the gallery, where the exhibition had opened in June. The space had been transformed. Sasha's team had handled that, with the particular confidence of people who transformed spaces for a living. And the result was neither the austere white cube gallery aesthetic nor the heavy golden chandelier luxury register that Amelia had been half expecting. It was something in between, warm and specific, with the pieces from the exhibition distributed through the space so that the artwork was present in the room rather than displayed above it. The central piece, still rising, stood at the far end of the main room, and the sight of it when she walked in hit her somewhere below the ribs, the way her own work sometimes did in unexpected moments, when she forgot for a second that she'd made it and saw it fresh. She was wearing a dress she'd bought in Savannah with Sasha's pragmatic assistance. Dark green, simple, the kind of dress that let a person be themselves in it rather than becoming the dress. She'd done almost nothing to her hair. Sasha had looked at her for a moment in the hotel room and said, "That's exactly right." And Amelia had chosen to take it at face value. The room filled quickly. She moved through it with more ease than she'd had in Chicago in June. The months of openings and meetings and conversations with strangers had not made her a social person. She didn't think she was going to become one, but she'd developed a working competence with it, a way of being present without performing. She saw Adrian from across the room at 9 o'clock. She'd known he was going to be there. Beaumont had told her directly and without apology. He asked to attend. I told him the event was open to the industry. I'm telling you because you deserve to know. She'd said, okay, meaning it, more or less. She'd had 6 weeks to prepare for it. Prepared and ready were different things. He looked diminished was the first word that arrived, and she pushed it away because it was too satisfying, and satisfaction at his diminishment was not the feeling she wanted to be standing in. He'd lost weight. He was wearing a suit that was correct in every technical sense and looked on him like something borrowed. He was with a woman she didn't recognize, not Camille, who had, by all accounts, found his public catastrophe incompatible with the life she was building. And the woman was doing the thing that people do at events with people they're not sure about, standing slightly apart. He saw her, and the room did the thing rooms do when two people who have a history lock eyes across them. The ambient noise continued, the people continued, but there was a localized stillness between them. She crossed to him. She did it consciously and deliberately, because the alternative was spending the entire evening tracking his location, and she didn't want to do that. "Adrian?" she said. "Amelia." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't categorize cleanly. Something in it was grief, and something was relief, and something was the specific shame of a person who has seen themselves clearly and hasn't decided what to do with the view. Thank you for coming," she said, cutting off the adjective gently but definitively. "I mean it. There's a foundation being launched tonight. I'd like you to know about it." He blinked. She could see him recalibrating. He'd expected something, anger or coldness, or the specific social punishment of being visibly ignored, and she was giving him none of those things. "The Cross Beaumont Foundation," he said. "I read about it. It's going to fund artists in non-traditional circumstances, veterans in transition, people who've been doing the real work without the institutional support." She said it without emphasis, but she watched him hear it, the specific words landing where she'd known they would. "Amelia, I took your advice," she said. "The lawyer. I called someone other than Paul." He looked at her carefully. "Patricia Chen." "Yes, we're finalizing the settlement next month. The revised terms." She met his eyes. "It's fair. I made sure of it." He absorbed this. She watched something happen in his face. Not surrender exactly, but the thing that comes before whatever comes after surrender, the moment of accepting that the landscape has changed and cannot be changed back. "I called Beaumont," he said. "I don't know if he told you." He mentioned it. There are conversations that need to happen. Carter Webb's editor has been in contact. He stopped. "I'm trying to do the right thing. I know that sounds..." "It sounds like what you're doing," she said. "That's enough." He looked at her. For a moment she saw the face she'd known at 24, at the open house in the rain, looking at the scale model and telling her exactly what was wrong with it, with the certain intensity of someone who could see something real. That person had been real too. That was the thing she'd had to learn to hold without it destroying her. The people who hurt you are also real people, before and after, and the hurt doesn't cancel the reality any more than the reality cancels the hurt. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for the divorce. I know." He paused. "I think the divorce was probably honest, at least. But the other things. The way I made you..." He stopped again, and she saw him struggling with the sentence. "The way people do when the truth is specific and they're not used to specificity about their own failures. You were invisible in my life, and I made you that way, and I didn't let myself see it." She stood with that. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he'd said to her in years, possibly the most honest thing he'd said to her ever. "Thank you," she said. "For saying it." He nodded, a single movement, and she saw him pull himself back together, the management returning, the presentation reflex, not maliciously, but because it was what he knew how to do. "The woman I came with," he said, "is my sister. I thought you should know." She hadn't known he had a sister. That thought was followed immediately by the recognition that there had been a great many things she hadn't known, and that this was its own kind of information. "It's good you have someone here," she said. She excused herself and went to find Beaumont. He was near the central piece, standing with Miriam Holt and two women Amelia hadn't met yet, members of the Foundation's initial advisory board, it turned out, a photographer and a former combat medic who had turned to landscape painting after 2 deployments and whose work Beaumont had been collecting for several years. He introduced them, and the 4 of them stood near, still rising, and talked about the Foundation for 20 minutes. And the conversation had that specific quality that Amelia had started to recognize, the quality of something real being organized, not performed. At 10:30, Beaumont gave a short speech. He spoke about Daniel without sentimentality and without the performance of grief, The way people speak about the dead when they've done enough of the work to be able to carry them without breaking under them. He talked about the foundation. He talked about what it was trying to do in terms that were precise and uninflationary. We are trying to find the people doing real work in the places we haven't been looking and open the doors we have access to so the work can move through them. That is all. It sounds small. It is not small. He introduced Amelia. She stood up and said approximately 4 sentences and sat down again, because she'd decided that 4 sentences was what she had, and more than that would be performing. Sasha, sitting behind her, put a hand briefly on her shoulder. At 11, she stepped outside. The West Loop in late August was warm enough that she didn't need a jacket, but cool enough that the air was a relief after the body heat of the room, and she stood on the sidewalk and looked at the street for a while. The taxicabs, and the distant sound of a train somewhere, and the particular nighttime quality of a city block between events. She took out her phone and called Knox. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. He was almost always awake at this hour. She'd come to understand that his nights were complicated in ways he didn't discuss in detail, that the war had done something to his sleep that was neither dramatic nor resolved. "How'd it go?" he said. "It went." She leaned against the building's exterior wall. Adrian was here. A beat. "And?" "We talked. He apologized. A real one, I think. Not a full one, but real." She looked at the street. "I don't know what to do with it yet." "You don't have to do anything with it yet," Knox said. "I know. You sound tired." "I am tired." She was the specific tired of a day that had asked many things of her, that had required her to be multiple versions of herself in rapid succession. The artist, the founder, the ex-wife, the woman on the billboard, the woman who had driven back from Chicago at 2 a.m. 6 weeks ago and was still figuring out who she was outside of the context that had defined her for a decade. "The guys built a fire," Knox said. "In the equipment yard. Decker's burning what's left of the chassis frames from Bay 2. She almost laughed. "A fire. In the equipment yard." "It's a thing," he said. "Ruth made chili. It's not great chili. It's not bad chili." "It's not bad chili," he agreed. "Come home when you're ready." She stood on the Chicago sidewalk with his voice in her ear and the city going about its business around her. "Come home." She hadn't asked him to say it that way. He hadn't been trying to say something significant. It was just the word that had come, because it was the accurate word, and Knox Mercer was a man who said the accurate word when he had one and said nothing when he didn't. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "Drive safe," he said. "The weather app says there's something coming through Tennessee around noon." "I'll leave early." "Okay." A pause, the comfortable kind. "Night, Amelia." "Night, Knox." She stood outside for another few minutes, the warm August air moving around her, the city making its city sounds, and thought about the figure at the center of the room behind her, arms extended, balance achieved, reaching forward. She thought about a bunkhouse room with an army surplus blanket and a wall unit that worked if you hit it twice. She thought about coffee gone cold on a marble counter in Miami, which had been the worst detail and which was, finally, starting to become just a detail, emptied of the specific grief it had carried. She went back inside. The room was warm and the pieces were right, and still rising, stood at the far end with the particular authority of something that had been made in the dark by someone who didn't know yet what they were making, but had made it anyway because the hands needed to, and the metal was there, and the welder was on. She walked the length of the room toward it, and the crowd moved around her the way crowds move around the thing that the room is organized around, and she stood in front of it for a long moment with her hands at her sides, and let herself feel the full weight of how far she'd traveled from the night it was made. It was a lot of distance. She'd covered most of it alone in the dark, moving mostly on instinct and stubbornness, and the specific kind of faith that has nothing to do with certainty. The faith that says, keep going, not because you know where you're going, but because standing still is the only thing you're certain is wrong. She'd keep going. She left Chicago at 6 a.m. before the city had fully committed to being awake, and drove south through the gray pre-dawn with the windows down and the radio on low. The weather system Knox had mentioned was sitting over Tennessee like a sullen house guest that had decided to stay. She caught the edge of it outside Chattanooga, rain coming sideways off the mountains, the interstate narrowing in her headlights to a gray tunnel of water and asphalt. She slowed down and drove through it and came out the other side into Georgia sunshine that felt almost offensive in its cheerfulness after the week she'd had. She stopped at a gas station outside Dalton and bought a coffee that was better than it had any right to be, standing beside her car in the morning warmth, watching the traffic build on the interstate. A woman in a minivan 2 pumps over glanced at her twice, the second time with the particular look of someone deciding whether they recognize a face, and Amelia smiled at her without self-consciousness, which was something she couldn't have done 8 months ago, and got back in the car. She was back at Black Hollow by noon. The settlement was finalized in the 3rd week of September. Patricia Chen handled it with the efficient precision of someone who was very good at their job and who had understood the situation quickly enough not to require extensive explanation. The revised terms were better than the original by a margin that Adrian had not contested, which Patricia said was unusual and which Amelia understood to be its own kind of accounting, a man settling a debt that existed in more than one register. She signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon at Patricia's office in Savannah, at a desk overlooking a parking garage, which she found appropriately undramatic. No marble counter, no phone being checked, just a pen and a signature line and then a second signature line, and then it was done, 10 years of marriage reduced to its legal conclusion and filed with the county. Patricia slid the final page across. "That's it." Amelia looked at the signature. Her name in her own handwriting, which had always been slightly irregular, the letters not quite even, a consequence of being left-handed in a right-handed world. "That's it," she said. She drove back to Black Hollow and went directly to the workshop and made something she hadn't planned to make. A small piece, the size of her hand, a flat disc of welded steel with a rough texture on one side and a smooth texture on the other. No figure, no form, just the material itself held in a shape. She didn't know what it meant yet. She set it on the workbench and looked at it for a while. Later she would understand that it was the first thing she'd made entirely for herself, with no audience in mind, no campaign context, no exhibition placement. Just the material and the heat and her own hands deciding what was true. Autumn came to Black Hollow the way it always did in that part of Georgia. Reluctantly, the heat persisting through October with the stubbornness of something that had been there a long time and saw no particular reason to leave. The equipment yard changed color in the afternoons as the light angled lower, the bikes casting longer shadows across the gravel. The old oak at the property line finally releasing its leaves in early November in a single extended week of red and brown that Amelia watched from the workshop doorway in the evenings, committing it to memory the way she'd started to commit many things at Black Hollow to memory, understanding that memory was the document you kept when nothing official was being recorded. The foundation officially opened its first grant cycle in October. 12 artists and 4 veterans received funding in the inaugural round, chosen from a pool of over 300 applications that had arrived in the 6 weeks since the foundation's website had gone live. Amelia read every application herself, which Miriam Holt said was unnecessary, and which Amelia did anyway because the applications were the whole point. They were the proof that the thing Beaumont had described, the people doing real work in the places nobody had been looking, was not a concept but a population, hundreds of them, working in garages and spare bedrooms and community centers and the backs of trucks, making things the world hadn't seen yet. She called Beaumont after reading the last batch. 347 applications, she said, in 6 weeks. I know. His voice had the quality it got when he was genuinely moved and choosing not to perform it. Miriam says we'll have twice that in the second cycle. We need more funding. We're working on it. Miriam has 3 conversations in progress. A pause. How are you? I read an application today from a woman in rural Alabama who makes sculptures out of discarded farm equipment, Amelia said. She's 62. She's been making them for 30 years and never shown them outside her county. Yes, Beaumont said. I saw that one. We're funding her. I assumed we were, he said. I just wanted to see how long it took you to say it. She laughed. Was that a test? More of a calibration, he said. You're making good decisions, Amelia. I'd like you to trust them without checking with me first. She sat with that for a moment. Old habit, she said. I know. Break it. She did gradually, the way you break habits that have been structural. Not all at once, not cleanly, but incrementally, each small decision made alone returning a piece of authority to its correct location. She hired a studio manager for the foundation, a woman named Danny, who had run a nonprofit arts organization in Atlanta and who had the specific quality of being both organized and genuinely committed to the work, which was a combination Amelia had learned to value above almost any other professional attribute. She signed a representation agreement with the gallery contact Beaumont had recommended, a man named Foster in New York, mid-50s, who spoke about art the way Decker spoke about engines, which is to say, functionally and without mystification, and who had looked at her portfolio for 20 minutes and said, "I can work with this," in the tone of someone making a statement of fact rather than a compliment. The divorce was done. The foundation was operational. The work was coming. New pieces, stranger and more ambitious than the Black Hollow series, using materials she hadn't worked with before, pushing into territory she couldn't fully see yet, which was where she'd learned the best things happened. And there was Knox. She'd been circling the fact of Knox Mercer for months, the way you circle a thing you don't know how to approach directly, identifying it from multiple angles without committing to a single point of entry. What she felt for him was not what she'd felt for Adrian at 24, not the pull of someone else's momentum, not the particular romance of believing in another person's ambitions. It was quieter than that and also larger, the way bodies of water are larger than rivers, even when they make less noise. She'd told herself repeatedly that she wasn't ready, and that was true. She'd also told herself that he wasn't interested, which was less clearly true. Knox was not a man who expressed things conventionally, but she'd spent enough time in his company to understand that the things he did, the loading dock vigils, the accurate words at the right moments, the knowledge of which questions to ask and which ones to leave alone, the way he'd stepped into the equipment yard the night Adrian had come and stood there without announcement or posture, were not behaviors that organized themselves randomly. She thought about this on a Wednesday evening in late October, sitting in the workshop with her jacket on because the season had finally relented and the evenings were genuinely cool. She was looking at a new piece rather than working on it, which was sometimes what the work required. Not action, but prolonged attention, waiting for the piece to tell you what it needed next. Knox came to the loading dock at his usual hour. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of his boots on the dock boards. She didn't look up from the piece. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Okay," he said. "Why do you come out here every night?" A beat. "Habit," he said. "Knox." Another beat. Longer. She heard him shift his weight. "Because it's where you are," he said. Just that. Flat and simple. The accurate word. She looked up then. He was leaning against the door frame, jacket open, arms not quite crossed, the posture of a man who had said the thing and was waiting to see what it did. His face was doing the thing his face did when he was present without armor, which she'd seen rarely enough to recognize it when it happened. "I'm not good at this," she said. "I know," he said. "Neither am I. I've been in this building for almost a year." 11 months, he said, which meant he'd been counting, which meant something. She set down the tool she'd been holding. "I'm going to be here for a while longer. I know that too. And then things are going to expand. New York, possibly London. The work is going to take me places." "Yes," he said. "And you're here. This is..." She gestured at the loading dock, the equipment yard, the compound in the dark behind him. "This is where you are." He looked at her steadily. "I know what I'm signing up for," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay small." She stood up from the oil drum. She crossed the workshop toward him, and he didn't move, just stood there while she came to stand in front of him, close enough to see the lines around his eyes that the war had put there and the years had settled. "I haven't trusted anyone new in a long time," she said. "I know," he said. "You trusted yourself. That was the right order." She looked at him for a moment. He had, she thought, an extraordinary quality of stillness, for someone who had as much noise inside him as she suspected he did. She'd learned to understand that the stillness was not absence. It was the specific kind of control that comes from having survived things that taught you the difference between what mattered and what didn't, and choosing to spend your energy on what mattered. She reached up and put her hand on the side of his face. His hand came up and covered hers, and neither of them said anything for a moment. There was nothing to perform. There was just the loading dock and the cool October air, and two people who had come to each other carrying damage in both hands and had spent almost a year being honest about it. "I'm still figuring things out," she said. "So am I," he said. "Most of it. That's terrifying." "Yes," he said, and something in the simplicity of the agreement made her feel unexpectedly and immediately better than she had in a long time. Tasuok. November arrived, not gently. November in coastal Georgia was assertive when it wanted to be, cold fronts pushing down from the north and the nights getting hard and clear, the kind of sky that had too many stars in it and made the world feel simultaneously enormous and specific. Amelia drove to Savannah for a meeting with Danny about the Foundation's second grant cycle and came back in the early evening to find the compound strung with temporary lights that had appeared without explanation and gave the equipment yard the quality of a place that had decided, for reasons of its own, to celebrate something. "What is this?" she said to Ruth, who was in the bar doorway. "Decker found them in the storage room. They've been in there for years. He figured it was time." "Time for what?" Ruth shrugged with the expressive minimalism she'd perfected over decades of managing other people's inexplicable decisions. "Time for lights, I guess." The men were in the equipment yard with a fire going in the metal drum they used for this, and the temporary lights ran along the fence line and up into the oak tree in a pattern that was not quite orderly and was better for it. Decker was holding court about something mechanical, his voice carrying over the fire's sound, and three of the younger guys were listening with the polite attention of people who had learned that Decker's mechanical stories always arrived at a point eventually. Knox was sitting on the step of his bike, coffee in hand, and he looked at her when she came through the gate with the specific expression that she'd been watching develop over months. The one that appeared when she came back from somewhere, not relief exactly, but something in that neighborhood. The particular relaxation of a person who doesn't acknowledge worry until the thing they were worried about has resolved. She sat beside him on the step. It wasn't wide enough for two people comfortably, which neither of them addressed. "Lights," she said. "Decker's thing," he said. "I told him not to climb on the fence. He ignored me. He ignores most things." "Yeah." He looked at the fire. "Foundation grant deadline today?" "Yesterday. We got 42 applications in the last 24 hours. "How many total?" 216 in the second cycle. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Daniel Beaumont would be—" He stopped. "Yeah," she said, "he would be." They sat with that for a while. The way you sit with the people who aren't there anymore, the ones the work is partly for, the ones who deserve doors that didn't open in time. Somewhere in the 6 months since Chicago, Amelia had come to understand what Beaumont had known when he walked into the Hollow on a January night and looked at a sculpture above the back bar and decided it was the real thing. He'd known that grief, if you let it, will eat you from the inside, and that the only answer he'd found that worked was to make the grief useful, to take the specific thing that had been lost and build a door in its shape so that other people could walk through. He'd built the foundation on his son's absence, and she'd built her portion of it on her own decade of invisibility. And somewhere in the joining of those two losses, they'd made something that was larger than either of them. That was the only version of justice she believed in anymore. Not punishment. Punishment was its own closed loop, consuming the person who sought it, along with the person it was aimed at. But making something that outlasted the damage. That was different. That was worth the work. Adrian settled his professional reckoning in the way that such things settle, which is slowly and incompletely and with less drama than the initial exposure had generated. He gave a formal acknowledgement to Carter Webb in a follow-up interview. Not the full accounting, but substantively honest, the kind of statement that legal counsel allows and that contains enough truth to count. He reached a private agreement with the Beaumont estate regarding the Palm Beach project that Amelia was not privy to and didn't ask about, because it wasn't hers to ask about. Vale Architecture restructured. 2 of the 3 partners stayed. He was still practicing, scaled back, quieter. She found that she thought about him less than she'd expected to, and that when she did, the feeling was not the hot and complicated thing it had been for months, but something more like the feeling you have about a weather event that changed the landscape, present in the topography, no longer happening. He sent her a brief message in December, not an email. a handwritten note, which she hadn't expected. He wrote that he'd seen the foundation's grant announcements and that he thought what she was building was real and that he hoped she knew that. He wrote one more sentence at the bottom, separate from the rest, that said, "You were always the architect. I just never said it." She read it twice and set it down and didn't respond, not because she was unwilling, but because she had nothing to add to it. He'd said the accurate thing. It had arrived approximately 10 years late. Sometimes things arrived late and were still true. And there was nothing to do with that except receive it and let it settle. In the early spring of the following year, Amelia's second solo exhibition opened in New York. Not the companion campaign show, something entirely separate. A body of new work that she and Foster had developed over 6 months. 23 pieces ranging from small, handheld things, like the smooth and rough disc she'd made the day the divorce was finalized, to 2 large-scale installations that had required structural engineering consultation and 3 weeks of gallery prep to mount correctly. The largest piece was 9 feet tall. It was made from industrial cable, reclaimed steel beam, and 800 small components she'd fabricated individually over 4 months, each one slightly different, each one connected to the others in a structure that was simultaneously rigid and appeared to be in motion, the kind of tension that architecture achieves when it's working, when the structural logic becomes indistinguishable from the aesthetic logic. She'd titled it Infrastructure, and she would have been lying if she claimed the title was not deliberate. Beaumont flew in for the opening. So did Miriam Holt, and Danny, and a dozen of the Foundation's first cycle grantees who had been invited specifically because Amelia had asked Foster to make sure they were on the list, because the opening should have in it the people the work was connected to, not just the people who could afford to buy it. Ruth came. She'd taken the train from Savannah, which she described on the phone as an adventure in the specific tone of a woman who found adventures mildly irritating but would not have missed this one. She stood in the gallery in front of Infrastructure for a long time without speaking, and when she finally turned to Amelia, her expression was the one she reserved for things that had genuinely moved her, which was an expression she didn't deploy casually. "You did that," she said, "with a lot of help." "Sure," Ruth said, "but you did that." Knox didn't come to the opening. He'd offered, and she'd known when he offered that it would cost him something. The city, the crowd, the specific context of people and noise and performance that he'd structured his life to minimize. She'd said, "Come if you want to. Don't if you don't. I'll tell you about it when I get back." He'd looked at her for a moment with the expression that she'd learned to read as the specific relief of someone being given permission to be who they were. "I'll watch the bikes," he said. "The bikes don't need watching." "They're better for the attention," he said. She'd laughed and kissed him and driven north, and he'd watched the bikes and she'd had her opening, and neither of them had needed the other to be somewhere they weren't. That was the thing she'd come to understand, that she'd spent 10 years getting wrong. She'd believed that love meant occupying the same space, merging trajectories, subordinating one orbit to another until they were the same orbit. She'd done it completely and called it partnership, and watched it hollow her out from the inside, slowly enough that she'd adapted to the hollowness and stopped recognizing it as loss. What she had with Knox was not without difficulty. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own accounting of it, because the story that got told about people who had survived hard things and found their way to each other was almost always cleaner than the reality. Knox had nights that belonged to things that had happened in Iraq, and that she couldn't reach and wasn't supposed to reach. They were his, and the work of processing them was his, and the best she could do was be present without making her presence a demand. She had days when the accumulated weight of the year, the campaign, and the foundation, and the legal resolution, and the public exposure, and the long process of rebuilding her sense of herself from the studs up, pressed down with a heaviness that she couldn't explain and couldn't work her way out of. When she sat in the workshop not making anything and felt the specific gray of a recovery that was real but not linear. They were honest about these things, imperfectly, with backtracking, with the occasional conversation that went sideways before it went anywhere useful, with the communication failures that happen between people who have both learned, in different ways, to be private with their inner lives. But honest. That was the foundation. Not effortless compatibility. They were too different for that, too shaped by separate damage, but the commitment to not lying about how things were, even when how things were was complicated and unclear. What? The woman from Alabama, the one who'd been making sculptures from farm equipment for 30 years, had her first exhibition in Birmingham in March, funded in part by the Foundation's first cycle grant. Amelia couldn't attend. She was in New York for a second week of events around the exhibition. She sent a message instead, brief, saying she was thinking of her. The woman wrote back 2 days later. Her name was Celeste. She was 63, and she wrote in the way of someone who used language carefully because she'd learned it was worth caring about. She said the exhibition had brought in 400 people in the first weekend. She said her granddaughter had stood in front of one of the large pieces and told her she didn't know Grandma made real art. She said she wasn't sure what to do with that sentence, and she was still thinking about it. Amelia read the message 3 times. She was sitting in her New York hotel room, the same kind of room she'd sat in a year ago, ordering room service and calling Ruth. The lake view was gone, replaced by a view of the building across the street, which had a water tower on the roof and pigeons on the water tower, and the general purposeful grayness of a city going about its permanent business. She thought about what Celeste's granddaughter had said. She thought about the way the real thing is often invisible to the people closest to it, not from malice, but from proximity. You can't see what's in your own landscape because you've been inside it too long. It becomes the background, the assumed condition, the air. She thought about herself at 50, at 60, if she'd stayed on the trajectory she'd been on. If she'd signed the papers on the marble counter in November and moved into whatever the next stage of being Adrian Vale's ex-wife looked like, a smaller life in the shadow of a career she'd helped build without acknowledgement. She thought about the car dying on I-95, the hazard lights blinking orange in the rain. She thought about Decker's hand over hers adjusting the welder angle. She thought about Knox at the loading dock saying, "Don't lead it, let the bead follow the joint." The things that changed your life were so rarely the things you planned. They were the car that broke down, the bar you walked into out of the rain, the sculpture someone put on a shelf above the back bottles without asking. They were the specific qualities of specific people encountered in the specific circumstances that circumstance arranged, and none of it was legible in advance. You couldn't plan for the real things. You could only stay open enough to recognize them when they arrived, and that required a particular kind of not knowing yet, which was the hardest thing to maintain when the world kept rewarding people who performed certainty. She wrote back to Celeste. She said, "Your granddaughter is right, and now she knows. That's not nothing. That's actually everything." But she drove back to Black Hollow on a Thursday in late March, the second spring since she'd arrived, and the dogwoods were doing their annual impossible thing along the county road, white and pink against the gray-green of the Georgia pines, the particular extravagance of early spring in the South that she'd grown up with and stopped seeing and was seeing again. She turned into the Black Hollow Drive, and the gravel crunched under the tires the way it always did, and the bikes were lined up along the fence in their familiar configurations, and smoke was coming from the bar's chimney because Ruth kept the wood stove going until April, regardless of what the thermometer said, and the oak tree in the corner was doing something tentative with its first leaves. Not committed yet, but considering it. She parked and got her bag and stood for a moment in the drive. Knox was in the garage bay doorway. She could see him from where she stood, in his usual posture, the specific stillness of a man who had heard her car on the county road a full minute before it turned in. He was looking at her with the expression she'd memorized over the past year and a half, the one that appeared when she came back from somewhere and resolved something she hadn't known needed resolving. He didn't wave. He didn't perform relief. He just stood there in the garage doorway in the morning light, looking at her with the open and undecorated attention that was, she had come to understand, his primary language of affection. She walked across the gravel to him. "How was New York?" he said. "Real," she said. "Loud. Good." He nodded. His hand came up and touched the back of her arm briefly, the specific gesture he used when words were beside the point. "Ruth made something for dinner," he said. "She's being evasive about what it is." "That's ominous." "Yeah." He turned back into the garage. "Come look at something." She followed him into the bay. On the workbench, next to the tools and the cloth and the parts organized with his particular neatness, was a small object she didn't recognize. She picked it up. It was welded steel, hand-sized, rough in places and smooth in others, familiar in approach, but not her work. She looked at him. "Decker's idea," he said, looking at the workbench rather than at her. He said if you could do it, Probably anybody could. I told him that wasn't true. A pause. He showed me some basics. She turned the piece over in her hands. It was awkward in the way of a first piece. The joins were uneven, the form uncertain, reaching towards something it hadn't quite arrived at. It looked like the work of someone who had needed to make something and had figured out the minimum required to do it. She could see in it, if she knew how to look, the same thing she'd felt in her own first pieces, the specific urgency of a person processing something real. "Knox," she said. "It's not good," he said. "It's a first piece." She set it down carefully. "What were you thinking about when you made it?" He was quiet for a moment. "My guys," he said, "from the unit." He didn't say more than that. He didn't have to. She looked at the piece, she looked at him. "Make another one," she said. He looked at her with the expression that meant he was absorbing something. "Next time," she said, "I'll show you what Decker showed me." He looked at the piece on the workbench for a moment. Then he looked at the equipment yard outside, the bikes and the gravel and the tentative oak tree, and she watched something happen in his face that was quiet and significant and that she understood to be, for Knox Mercer, the approximate equivalent of what other people would call joy. "Okay," he said. There is a particular kind of life that doesn't get told often, in the stories people pass around. It's not the life of the triumphant comeback or the clean revenge or the before and after that resolves into permanent improvement. It's the life of the slow, imperfect rebuild, the one that happens in workshops and spare bedrooms and bunkhouses with army surplus blankets, the one that moves in 2 steps forward and 1 step sideways, the one that doesn't resolve into a photograph, but into a daily practice of choosing the difficult true thing over the easy, comfortable lie. Amelia Cross had not gotten everything she deserved. She was still not entirely sure what she deserved, and she'd grown suspicious of the word itself, its implicit promise of ledgers that balanced, of scales that leveled eventually, of justice that arrived in proportion to the wound. The world did not reliably work that way. What had happened to her had happened, and what had happened to Daniel Beaumont had happened, and the scales had not balanced so much as they had been picked up and carried forward and put to use. What she had instead of a balanced ledger was a foundation that was funding 216 people in its second grant cycle, some of whom would be discovered, and some of whom would keep working in their garages and spare rooms and back lots regardless, because the making was the point and not the being found. What she had was work, her own work, strange and growing, and not entirely knowable to her yet, which was the condition she'd come to require of it. What she had was a community of people who had never asked her to fit a shape, who had watched her find her own shape without instruction or interference, and who had, in their collective matter-of-fact way, simply made room for her to become herself. What she had was Knox, imperfect and present and honest in the specific way of someone who has decided that honesty is the only available foundation after enough dishonesty has collapsed underneath you. She did not know the full shape of what they were. She knew it was real and that it was enough for now, and that enough for now was not nothing. It was actually most of what was available to anyone if they were being careful and truthful about it. There is a thing that happens to certain women at a certain point in their lives, usually after a loss that should have broken them and didn't, when they stop building themselves around other people's needs and start building something they actually meant to build. The world notices this belatedly and calls it a comeback, a reinvention, a transformation, because the world prefers legible narratives with before and afters. But the women themselves know it's not that. It's not a transformation. It's a return to the person they were before they learned to make themselves smaller. The person they would have been continuously if the world had let them, which it generally doesn't, which is a failure of the world and not of the person. Amelia Cross was not transformed. She was returned, and the returning was not finished, because that kind of work is not the kind that finishes. It's the kind you choose every day, imperfectly, with the tools that are available, in the specific light of wherever you happen to be. Some morning she stood in the workshop in the early light before the rest of Black Hollow was awake, coffee in hand, looking at whatever piece was current, and she felt something she couldn't name cleanly and had stopped trying to name. A kind of recognition, the sensation of being exactly where you are, fully, without apology or wish for elsewhere. It didn't arrive every morning. Some mornings she felt the old weight, the old inadequacy, The voice that sounded like Adrian's and wasn't really Adrian's, that was older than Adrian and had nothing to do with him. The voice that said, "You don't fit." On those mornings, she picked up the welder anyway. She let the bead follow the joint. She made the thing. That was it. That was the whole of it. Out in the equipment yard, the bikes sat in their line and the oak tree came into its spring leaves, and the county road ran in both directions, toward everywhere. And Black Hollow held its ground in the Georgia morning like something that had always been there and always intended to stay. Not permanent, nothing was permanent, but stubborn and real and present in the specific way of things that have earned their place by simply refusing, over and over, to be otherwise.